Clara Mae Whitlock snatched the auctioneer's hand off her arm the moment he grabbed her. Not a flinch, not a shrink, but a hard, deliberate pull that made the whole crowd go silent. She turned to face every single person in that square, her eyes moving from face to face, daring anyone to look away. Nobody did. Nobody helped either. Then the auctioneer laughed, held up 2 fingers, and told the town she wasn't worth more than $2. The crowd laughed with him. She didn't move. She didn't break. But one man stopped laughing because he had never started. If this story reaches something in you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. Because what happens between this woman and that cowboy will change the way you think about worth, courage, and what it really means to be seen. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The quarterly labor auction in Willow Creek, Colorado was never a dignified affair, but the summer of 1879 brought out the worst of it. The heat was savage, and the crowd was restless, and Horace Dunner, the auctioneer, a wide man with a voice built for livestock sales, was working the square like a man who enjoyed his work a great deal more than the work deserved. Clara Mae Whitlock stood at the back of the waiting group and watched him. She was 26 years old. She had been deaf since she was 4. A fever that took her hearing in the span of 3 days and left everything else intact, including the particular kind of intelligence that grows in people who learn early that the world will not slow down for them. She was a big woman, full-figured and broad-shouldered, and she wore a brown frontier dress that had been washed so many times the color had mostly given up. Her dark hair was pinned back. Her hands were folded in front of her. She was watching Dunner's mouth the way she watched everything completely missing. Nothing reading every syllable off the movement of his lips, because reading the world was the only access to it she'd ever had. She watched him call up the man in front of her. A farmhand. Lost his land to bad weather and worse luck. The crowd gave him mild interest, 2 bids done in under 3 minutes. Then Dunner looked at her. She knew that look. She had been collecting it her whole life, the particular shift in a person's face when they remembered what they knew about her. Not quite contempt. Not quite pity. Something that lived between the two and belonged to neither. He waved her forward. Clara climbed the platform steps without hurrying. She had decided a long time ago that she would not hurry for an audience like this one. She reached the top and turned to face the crowd, and she stood straight, both hands flat against her thighs, and she looked at them all without flinching. Dunner's mouth moved. She caught fragments deaf can't hear, burden no use to a working man. She caught the word dangerous, as in a woman who couldn't hear danger coming was dangerous to have around. She caught the shape of the crowd's response, felt it more than heard it, the particular vibration of group laughter running through the wooden platform beneath her feet. She kept her chin up. Dunner turned back to the crowd, held up 2 fingers. $2. The laughter got louder. She felt it in her bones, literally through the platform, through the soles of her worn boots, and she stood inside it, the way you stood inside a storm you could not outrun. She had learned that trying to outrun it only made it worse. You stood. You waited. You did not give them the satisfaction of watching you break. $2, she thought. For 26 years. For every morning I decided to get up when I had every reason not to. For every word I taught myself to say without being able to hear my own voice. $2. Nobody bid. The crowd looked at her, the way people looked at something unfortunate present noted, already being forgotten. Dunner made another appeal. She could read his performance without sound. Real bargain, strong back, somebody must need, and still nothing. Hands stayed down. Eyes drifted. She was going to walk back down those steps unclaimed. She had done it before. She knew the county shelter, knew the cot in the back room, knew the cook who gave her slightly less soup than everyone else, as if even that small charity had a limit. She was already organizing that knowledge into a plan when someone moved at the edge of the crowd. Not loudly. I didn't shout, didn't wave, didn't make any performance of it at all. He stepped forward and raised one hand, and the entire quality of Dunner's attention changed in an instant, the way a man in commerce pays attention to money. And Clara looked at him. I was tall and lean, somewhere in his late 30s, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. He wore plain trail clothes, good leather, and he stood the way men stood when they had never in their adult lives worried about being told to move along. He was not looking at her with pity. He was not looking at her with the particular smug satisfaction of a man about to do something generous in front of an audience. He was looking at her the way you looked at a person. Just a person standing on a platform, and he was apparently the only one in the entire square who had noticed she was actually there. Dunner said something to him. The man answered short, direct 2 words that Clara read clearly off his lips: "I'll pay." Dunner turned to the crowd with some closing remark she didn't bother trying to read. It didn't matter. The crowd was already moving on to the next thing the way crowds did when the entertainment concluded. The man pulled 2 coins from his coat pocket and handed them to Dunner without looking at him. Then he stepped to the base of the platform steps and looked up at her. He waited until she was looking directly at his face. Then he said, "You ready?" No preamble. No explanation of what he expected, or what she owed him, or how fortunate she ought to feel. Just a direct question offered to her face, and the implicit understanding that her answer would be treated like an answer. She gave him a single nod. She came down the steps and walked to stand beside him. He didn't take her arm, didn't guide her, just turned and walked, and she walked alongside him, and that was the beginning of it. His name was Nathaniel Caldwell. Nate, to everyone who worked for him. He owned 12,000 acres of Colorado cattle land, 300 head of livestock, and a reputation across 4 counties for being hard and fair in equal measure. He had come into Willow Creek that morning for supplies, flour, salt, a replacement bridle, and he had stood at the edge of that crowd for less than 5 minutes before Clara was called up. I was not a sentimental man. The people who knew him would have told you that plainly. He did not make decisions based on feeling. He made them based on a clear-eyed reading of what was true, and what was true in that square was that an entire crowd of people had agreed on a wrong answer, and he was the only one positioned to do anything about it, so he did. He fetched his horse from the hitching post and looked at her, making sure she could see his face before he spoke. "Can you ride?" "Yes," she said. Her voice carried the slight flattening of tone that came from not being able to hear herself. Not weak, not apologetic, just her actual voice coming out the way it always had. He nodded. Untied the second horse, the one he'd brought for hauling supplies now without supplies, and she mounted without asking for assistance, and without making anything of it. He noted that. He noted the other thing too, the way she turned in the saddle almost immediately and looked at the sky and the land around her with the full attention of someone reading a language others couldn't see. They rode out of Willow Creek without speaking. Nate was not a man compelled to fill silence. It occurred to him somewhere around the 2nd mile that silence might be the one thing he and this woman already understood the same way. Then she reached out and tapped his arm, quick, firm, deliberate, and when he turned, she pointed west. He looked. The cloud formation building along the ridge had the green-gray tint and speed that meant hail minimum and possibly worse. He had not been watching the sky. She had been watching it from the moment they left town. "You're right," he said, already turning his horse toward the high trail. He made sure she could see his face. "Good eye." She gave him nothing back, no smile, no acknowledgement of the compliment. She had already turned back to watching the ridge. He found he didn't mind the absence of performance. He had spent years surrounded by people who performed constantly, and he had forgotten what it felt like to be around someone who simply was. They reached the ranch before the worst of the weather hit. Cal Briggs, his foreman, 11 years on the property, opinions on everything, was waiting on the porch steps. He took in Nate's return the supply horse without supplies, and Clara in one long skeptical sweep. "That ain't flour," Cal said. "Observant," Nate said. "Nate." Cal dropped his voice, which meant nothing to Clara, but which Nate recognized as the register of a man about to say something he'd decided required privacy. "What exactly are we doing here?" She needed work. I had work. Storm's coming, so this conversation keeps. He turned to Clara, making sure she could see him. "This is Cal Briggs. Runs the day-to-day. He'll get you settled." Cal turned to her with the expression of a man who had never in his life navigated this particular social territory, and was uncertain of the rules. He spoke too slowly, but at least he faced her. "Ma'am, you done ranch work before." "Cooking," Clara said. "Livestock, mending fence." A beat. "I learn fast." Cal looked at Nate. "She talks." "Most people do, Cal." The first week tested everything. Douglas the cook, a barrel-chested man with opinions about his kitchen that bordered on theology, assigned Clara the bread and the beans on her first morning, delivering the information while standing half-turned so she could only read part of it. Clara walked around to face him directly and made him repeat it. He did, annoyed. She nodded and went to work. The bread she made was better than Douglas's bread. He didn't say so, but he stopped standing sideways when he talked to her. By the third day, she had flagged a lame ankle on a heifer that 3 experienced hands had walked past for a week. She didn't call anyone over. She found Cal, looked him in the face, and demonstrated, pointed to the animal, pointed to the front left leg, made the motion of weight distribution with her hand precise and unmistakable. Cal watched, frowned, and called the vet. The vet confirmed it. Cal came to find Nate that evening. He stood in the doorway of the main house with his hat in both hands, which meant he was revising something he'd previously decided. "She found the lame heifer," Cal said. "I heard. I checked that animal 2 days ago." "I know." Cal turned his hat once. "How'd she catch it?" "She watches things," Nate said. "She doesn't have the choice not to." Cal worked that over in his head for a moment. Then he nodded the nod of a man absorbing a fact he can't argue with and went back to work. That was the thing about Cal. He was stubborn about being wrong, but he was honest about being corrected. It was his best quality. Clara, meanwhile, had started a notebook. Nate discovered it at the end of that first week. He came around the side of the kitchen in the early evening and found her sitting on the back step with a small leather-bound book, writing in a small, neat hand. He almost kept walking. Instead, he went back inside, poured 2 cups of coffee, and brought them out. She looked up when the cup appeared in front of her. She took it without ceremony. He sat down beside her. "What are you writing?" he asked, waiting until she was looking at his face. She held the notebook out. He took it and looked. Lists, detailed, methodical, organized in a way that told him immediately the mind behind them was not simply observant, but analytical. The state of the east fence line section by section. A note on the heifer, her condition, and the probable duration of recovery. A rough accounting of cook supplies, cross-referenced against projected consumption for the next 6 weeks. He looked up. "You're doing inventory." "Somebody is," she said. "Cal does inventory. Cal misses things. No edge to it. No performance of cleverness. Just a fact stated plainly the way she stated everything." "You're right," Nate said. "He does." She nodded. He was starting to understand that nod, the small, firm acknowledgement she gave when someone said something accurate. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was precision. You earned it by being right, and he was beginning to understand that being right around Clara Whitlock was the only currency that counted. "Can I show this to Cal?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "He won't listen to me." "He will if I—" "That's not listening to me," she said. "That's listening to you." Nate stopped. He sat with that for a moment, long enough to feel the full weight of it. She was right. And the fact that she was right pointed to something larger and more uncomfortable. Something about what it meant that he'd had to buy her for $2 before anyone in Willow Creek would treat her like she had anything worth hearing. "Then I'll set up a meeting," he said. "You present it yourself. He directs his questions to you, not me." She looked at him. Something shifted in her eyes, not quite surprise, but the thing that lived close to surprise in a person who had learned not to expect much. "You'd do that." "It's your work," he said. "Why would I stand in front of it?" The meeting happened 3 days later. Cal came in skeptical and left quiet with 2 property problems identified and 3 solutions already half-formed. He didn't thank Clara. He wasn't built for that yet. But he stopped treating her observations like suggestions and started treating them like data, and for Cal Briggs, that was a significant revision. The trouble when it came from a hand named Peterson. Peterson had been on the ranch 4 years, and he had the particular resentment of a man whose value to the operation had just been quietly diminished by someone he'd already decided didn't count. He was not loud about it. He was the kind of man who made his opinions known in small grinding ways, speaking about Clara, in her presence, when she couldn't read his lips, bypassing her marked observations, without acknowledgement, moving a sack of feed she'd flagged for inspection, and saying nothing. It was Thomas who told Nate. Thomas was 18, with the clear-eyed moral directness of someone who hadn't yet learned the complicated art of looking away. "She knows, sir," Thomas said. "She hasn't said anything, but she knows. I can tell." Nate went to the grain store. He found Peterson there making marks on the inventory wall, with the slightly too casual air of a man who knew he was about to be confronted. "You got something to say to me," Nate said from the doorway. Peterson turned, ran his calculation. "No, sir." "Then I'll say something to you." Nate kept his voice level. Level was more effective than loud, and he had learned that a long time ago. "Clara Whitlock found a fence post last week that was going to cost 3 times your monthly wage when a herd pushed through it. You've been here 4 years. She's been here 8 days. She found it in her first walk down." He let that sit. "You move one more thing she's marked. You talk about her in her presence one more time, and you'll be looking for work somewhere else before the week's out. We clear?" Peterson's jaw moved. "She's just a—" "I didn't ask for the end of that sentence," Nate said. "I asked if we were clear." A long beat. "Yes, sir." "Good." He walked back to the house, and something settled in him that he hadn't known was unresolved. Not satisfaction. The specific relief of doing something that should have been done sooner. The relief that came with recognizing a wrong and correcting it, not gracefully, not cleverly, but correctly. He told Clara that evening. Not because he needed to, but because she had a right to know what was happening in her own situation, and keeping her uninformed would have been another kind of disrespect, quieter than Peterson's, but not meaningfully different. She listened, watched, rather, her eyes fixed on his face, reading every word, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I did," he said. "And it should have happened sooner. I'm sorry it didn't." She looked at him, the way she sometimes looked at him, like she was reading him, the same way she read everything else completely and without assumption. Like she was determining what kind of man he actually was underneath the ranch and the reputation and the $2. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" She considered it. Someone who paid $2 and expected gratitude to cover the rest. "I don't want your gratitude," he said. "Then what do you want?" The question landed differently than he expected. Not the practical version of it, not what do you need done, what do you want from this arrangement, but the real version. The one underneath all the motion and function and forward momentum of a man who had been running a ranch and a life for so long that the running had become the entire point. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. "I used to know," he said. "When my wife was alive, I knew exactly what all of it was for. When she died—" He stopped, restarted. "I kept working because the work was there. But somewhere in the last 3 years, I lost the thread of what I was working toward." Clara was very still. "That's more than you asked for," he said. "I asked," she said. He looked at her. "Yeah, you did." The silence that followed held differently than their usual silence. He had not said those words to anyone in 3 years. He wasn't entirely sure why he was saying them now. He thought it had something to do with the way she listened, not with pity, not with the ready-made comfort people assembled when they sensed you were about to need something from them, but with the same complete attention she brought to everything. Like what he said actually mattered. Like he was a person saying a true thing, and that alone was sufficient reason to hear it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Thomas brought it to Clara in the east yard, and Nate watched from across the property as she read it, watched her face do something complex that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived at the meeting point of both. She held the letter for a long moment, then folded it carefully, like it was important, even if its contents were not welcome. That evening she came to the tack room doorway and stood there until he looked up. "My mother," she said. "She's been in a county house in Pueblo for 6 years. They're cutting the number of residents they can support. She said it with the flatness of a woman controlling her voice, very deliberately. They need to know if I can take her. Nate set down the harness. What does she need? She's not well enough to work. I didn't ask about work. Clara looked at him steadily. Nate, I have a room in the east wing that's empty, he said. It's nothing extraordinary, but it's warm and it's quiet. If she needs quiet, she can have it. You'd do that, Clara said. It came out less like a question, and more like a woman verifying something she wasn't sure she had permission to believe. I'd do that, he said. She went still. He watched the careful architecture of her self-possession, the control she exercised over every expression, every response built over years of being in rooms where showing vulnerability was never safe shift. Not collapse, just shift. The way a door shifts when something on the other side of it leans against it. Thank you, she said. And then quieter. I don't know what I would have done. You would have found something, Nate said. You always do. She held his gaze for a moment longer than usual, and then she nodded and walked back to the house, and he stayed in the tack room with the harness in his hands, and the evening settling over the property. And he thought about a crowd of people who had laughed at $2 as if the number confirmed something they already believed. He thought about what it cost to be wrong about a person. Not in money, in everything else. He hung the harness, turned down the lamp, and walked toward the main house, and it was somewhere in those 40 yards in the dark Colorado evening, with the stars beginning to assert themselves overhead, that the thought came to him quiet and clear and unprompted. Something about this ranch had begun to feel different. Not easier, not simpler, but inhabited in a way it hadn't been in a long time. He didn't know yet what to do with that. But across town, in the office of a man named Gerald Whitmore, land agent, county commissioner, and the most dangerous kind of dishonest man, the kind who wore respectability like a working suit, a conversation was happening that Nate knew nothing about. Whitmore had been watching the Caldwell land for 2 years. 12,000 acres, water rights on 3 creeks, access to the northern pass, the most valuable parcel in the territory, and the only thing standing between him and a railroad contract that would make him the wealthiest man in Colorado. He had a plan. And Nathaniel Caldwell, sitting 40 yards from his own front door, believing his biggest problem was a difficult foreman and a fresh start, had no idea it had already begun. The letter from Gerald Whitmore arrived on a Friday morning, and it was addressed not to Nate, but to the Caldwell Ranch in general, which was the first sign that the man behind it understood something about how power worked. You didn't threaten a man directly when you could threaten everything he'd built instead. Cal brought it to Nate at the breakfast table. He set it down without comment, which meant he'd already read the outside and didn't like what he saw. Nate picked it up, broke the seal, and read it once. Then he read it again. Clara was across the table working through her morning inventory notes. She looked up when Nate set the letter down, because she had learned to read the quality of his stillness, the way other people read tone of voice, and what she saw in him right now was not the stillness of a man thinking. It was the stillness of a man holding something back. She set down her pencil. What is it? Nate looked at her. He turned the letter and slid it across the table. She read it. Her face did not change, not visibly, not in any way that would have been readable to someone who didn't know her. But Nate had been watching her face for 2 months now, and he saw the slight tightening at the corner of her jaw. The single slow blink that meant she was processing something she didn't like. The letter was from Gerald Whitmore, County Land Commissioner. It was written in the smooth, careful language of a man who had spent years making threats sound like administrative notices. It stated in 3 paragraphs of impeccable legal phrasing that there was a question regarding the eastern boundary survey of the Caldwell land grant, a survey conducted in 1871, which Whitmore suggested may have contained a significant error. Until the matter was resolved, he wrote, he was obligated by his office to place a provisional hold on any land transactions, water rights agreements, or territorial claims originating from the affected parcel. The affected parcel was 4,000 acres, the 3 eastern creek crossings, the northern pass. In other words, everything that made the Caldwell Ranch worth what it was worth. Who is he? Clara asked, sliding the letter back. Land commissioner, Nate said. Appointed 2 years ago. Before that, he was a land agent out of Denver. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. He's been making noise about boundary surveys across the whole Northern Territory. I thought it was bureaucratic housekeeping. It isn't, Clara said. No, Nate said. It isn't. Cal, who had been standing in the doorway through all of this, cleared his throat. We got a lawyer. In Denver, Nate said. Harlan Moore, I'll wire him today. How long does a boundary dispute take to resolve? Cal asked. Depends on who's pushing it and why. Nate finally stood up, pushing back from the table. If Whitmore just wants money, we can deal with that. If he wants the land... He stopped. Then it's something else, Clara said. Nate looked at her. Then it's something else entirely. He rode into Willow Creek to send the wire, and while he was gone, Clara went to the ranch's document storage, a locked cabinet in the office off the main hall, and asked Thomas to help her find the key. Thomas, who had decided somewhere in the last 2 months that Clara Whitlock was the most straightforward person on the property, found the spare key in the desk drawer where Nate kept it and handed it over without asking why she needed it. She spent 3 hours in that office. She went through every document in the cabinet: land grants, survey maps, water rights agreements, correspondence with the territorial office. She moved slowly and thoroughly, the way she did everything, and she made notes in her book as she went. Most of it was exactly what it appeared to be: the clean paper trail of a legitimate operation built over 20 years. But there was something wrong with the 1871 survey map. Not wrong in the obvious way, not an error anyone had flagged or a discrepancy anyone had caught. Wrong in the subtle way that things were wrong when someone with enough knowledge and enough patience had been very careful not to be caught. She sat with the map for a long time, cross-referencing it against the water rights agreement from 1873 and the territorial boundary filing from 1875. She checked her own work twice. Then she sat back and looked at what she had found. The survey landmarks described in the 1871 document used a creek junction as a fixed reference point. The same creek junction appeared in both the 1873 and 1875 documents. But the junction coordinates listed in those 2 later documents were different from each other by a margin of approximately 40 yards, a margin that meant nothing on its own, but which, when mapped against the eastern boundary line, shifted the legal edge of the Caldwell land inward by exactly the distance needed to exclude the 3 eastern creek crossings from the property, not by accident. 40 yards didn't happen by accident. 40 yards in 2 separate documents, both filed during Whitmore's predecessor's tenure, both notarized by the same county clerk. That was a plan. That was someone years ago planting the seed of exactly this dispute, waiting for the right moment to water it. She was still sitting with the maps when Nate came back. She felt the vibration of boots on the front porch, and looked up as he came through the office door. He stopped when he saw the documents spread across the desk. What did you find? He said. She showed him. She walked him through it the way she walked through everything: methodical, precise, no dramatics, pointing to each document in sequence, showing him the coordinates, showing him the margin, showing him what the margin meant when you drew it out against the boundary line. Nate stood over the desk and looked at it all for a long time without speaking. He's had this planned, he finally said. It wasn't a question. For years, Clara said. The documents were filed before he took office. He inherited the setup, or he arranged it before he took office, which is worse. Why worse? Because it means he didn't see an opportunity, she said. He created one. Nate looked at her. You found this in 3 hours. I had good source material, she said. Clara. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, not quite raw, but close to it. I have the lawyer in Denver who has been handling my property filings for 15 years. He never caught this. He wasn't looking for it, she said simply. He had no reason to look, neither did you. Nate straightened. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she watched the set of his shoulders, the way a person's back could carry what their face was working to control. Then he turned around. Does this help us or hurt us, he said, finding it now. Clara considered the question honestly. Both, she said. It helps because we know what we're dealing with. It hurts because they know we know, or they will the moment we respond to that letter with anything except compliance. And if we comply, then in 90 days, he files the survey correction formally, the boundary shifts on paper, and you lose 4,000 acres and 3 water sources without ever setting foot in a courtroom. Nate looked at her for a long moment. And if we don't comply, then he takes it to the territorial court, Clara said. And it depends on whether we can prove the original survey was manipulated, which means we need the surveyor from 1871, his original field notes, and ideally, someone who can testify that the county clerk who notarized both later documents received a payment he shouldn't have. Nate was quiet. That's a tall order, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He sat down across from her, put his elbows on the desk, and looked at the documents between them. He looked tired, not physically, but in the deeper way of a man who had just had the solid ground of something he trusted turned over to reveal what was underneath it. How do you know all this? He said. Clara looked at him. Before the county shelter, she said. I worked for a land attorney in Pueblo for 2 years, filing mostly, some transcription. He let me sit in on hearings when there wasn't anyone else to handle his notes. A pause. A deaf woman in a room full of lawyers is invisible. I watched a great deal. Nate looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her, like he was recalculating something fundamental. You never told me that. You never asked what I did before Willow Creek. He had the grace to absorb that without deflecting. You're right, he said. I didn't. I'll wire Harlan Moore myself, Clara said. I can write out exactly what to look for, if you'll let me. Nate didn't hesitate. Yes. She wrote the wire that afternoon, 4 paragraphs precise and technical, laying out the coordinate discrepancy and specifying exactly which documents Moore needed to pull from the Territorial Archive in Denver. Thomas wrote it to the telegraph office and came back with a confirmation receipt before sundown. 2 days later, Moore wired back. She had been right on every point. Moore's response was long for a wire, and careful in the way of a man who had just realized the ground under his professional confidence had shifted. He confirmed the coordinate discrepancy. He confirmed both documents had been notarized by the same clerk, a man named Aldous Perry, retired from the county office 3 years ago, and now reportedly living considerably better than a retired clerk's pension explained. He stated that he would begin preparing a formal challenge immediately, and needed Nate in Denver within the week for depositions. Nate read the wire twice. Then he looked at Clara across the breakfast table, which was where he had taken to reading correspondence, now because she was always there in the mornings, and he had stopped pretending the arrangement was anything other than what it had become, which was the two of them working through the business of the ranch together. Moore says you should have been a lawyer, Nate said. Clara picked up her coffee. Moore should have caught it first. Nate's mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something in that direction, something that changed the quality of his face in a way she had noticed becoming more frequent. He folded the wire and put it in his coat pocket. I'll ride to Denver Monday. You should take the documents, she said. The originals. Don't send copies. Moore needs to see the physical paper. Agreed. He looked at her. I want you to go with me. She looked up. You understand this better than I do, he said. And Moore needs to hear it from the person who found it. She held his gaze for a moment. She was thinking about what it meant, not the logistics of it, but the other thing. The fact that he was asking. That he was treating her the way you treated a partner in something. Not a helper, not a convenience, a partner. All right, she said. They left Monday at dawn, and they were an hour outside Willow Creek when Nate said without looking at her, and then corrected himself and turned so she could see his face. I want to ask you something. Ask, she said. When you were reading those documents, he said, when you found it, the coordinate difference, what did you feel? She considered the question. Angry, she said. Why angry? You'd just found the key to the whole thing. Because it was elegant, she said. Whoever set it up was patient and clever, and they counted on nobody ever looking closely enough. And they were almost right. She paused. That's the kind of wrong that makes me angry. The kind designed to stay hidden. Nate looked at the road ahead for a moment. You said almost right. You bought me for $2, Clara said. I don't think that was part of their calculation. He looked at her. The morning light was coming over the ridge, and she could see the lines of his face clearly, the years in them, the tiredness that sat below the surface of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time without letting anyone help him carry it. No, he said. I don't think it was. Denver was 3 days' ride, and they made good time. Harlan Moore met them at his office on the third afternoon, a lean, careful man in his 50s who shook Nate's hand with the confidence of long association, and then turned to Clara with the particular expression of a man deciding in real time how to classify a person he hadn't classified before. Miss Whitlock, he said. He spoke facing her, which meant someone had told him, which meant Nate had told him. I've read Mr. Caldwell's description of your analysis. I'd like to hear it from you directly if you're willing. I'm willing, Clara said. She laid it out for him. Every document, every coordinate, every date, every name. Moore asked precise questions, and she gave precise answers, and at the end of an hour, he sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she recognized as professional respect, arriving slightly ahead of where a person expected to find it. The clerk, Moore said. Aldous Perry. I've been trying to get a thread on him for 6 years, different case, different county, same type of manipulation. I could never make the connection hold. He looked at Clara. You gave me the thread. Perry's the key, Clara said. If he'll testify or if you can demonstrate the payments. I can demonstrate the payments, Moore said. He turned to Nate. I've already pulled his personal ledger entries from the county archive. There are 3 deposits spaced 18 months apart, each just below the reporting threshold, starting in 1872. He laid 3 pages on the desk. Someone paid him to notarize the adjusted coordinates. The question is whether we can connect those payments to Whitmore. Or to whoever Whitmore is working for, Clara said. Both men looked at her. A county land commissioner doesn't do this on his own initiative, she said. The Eastern Creeks, the Northern Pass. That's railroad access. Someone wants a route, and Whitmore is the instrument, not the engineer. Moore was very still. Say that again. The Northern Pass, Clara said. It cuts 15 miles off any rail route from Denver north. If you hold the land on either side of that pass, you control the route. If Caldwell's eastern boundary shifts inward, the pass becomes unenclosed territory, which means it goes up for territorial claim. Moore turned to his desk and pulled out a map. He studied it for 30 seconds. Then he set it down and looked at Nate with an expression that was part urgency and part something close to alarm. She's right, he said. I've been looking at this as a land dispute. It isn't. What is it? Nate said. It's a railroad play, Moore said. And if I'm reading the timing correctly, we have about 60 days before Whitmore files the formal survey correction. Once it's filed, even if we challenge it, the territorial claim on the pass goes into dispute status, which means it's effectively frozen, which means no one can develop it, which means whoever wants the route has to come to them to negotiate, Clara said, on Whitmore's terms. Moore looked at her again, and this time the expression on his face was not quite respect. It was something closer to the specific awe of a man recognizing that he has been outpaced. Miss Whitlock, he said carefully. Where exactly did you say you worked before? I didn't, she said. Nate was watching her from across the room, and she felt it. His gaze, the quality of his attention, the particular weight of being seen by someone who had stopped trying to categorize what they were seeing and had simply started watching. She had learned his silences the way she had learned everything else in her life, through complete attention. This silence was different from the silence of a man working through a business problem. This was the silence of a man working through something much closer to himself. They had dinner that evening at a restaurant 2 blocks from Moore's office, a concession to the length of the day and the distance of the ride, and it was the first time Clara had sat in a public dining room with Nate since Willow Creek. The restaurant was quiet, the kind of quiet that meant expensive, and the people at the surrounding tables had the well-dressed ease of city money. A woman at the next table looked at Clara, and then at Nate, and then back at Clara, with the particular expression that certain people used when they felt that the social arrangement in front of them required comment. Nate didn't look at the woman. He looked at Clara, made sure she could see his face, and said, "Moore thinks we can get Perry to flip. If he's facing charges for falsifying documents, he'll give up whoever paid him." "Perry's a coward," Clara said. "Cowards flip." Nate's mouth moved again, that almost smile more frequent now than it had been. "How do you know he's a coward?" "A brave man doesn't take a bribe to falsify coordinates on a land survey," she said. "A brave man finds a different way to solve his financial problems. Perry took the easy money because he was afraid of the hard road. Men like that always fold when the pressure comes the other direction." Nate looked at her steadily. "You've thought a great deal about courage." "I've had reason to," she said. He held her gaze. "Clara." "Don't," she said. Not unkindly, just directly the way she said everything. He stopped. "Whatever you're about to say," she said, "I need you to be sure you mean it before you say it. I've had people feel sorry for me and call it something else my entire life. I'm not good at recovering from it." The silence that followed was the kind that cost something from both of them. "I know the difference," Nate said finally, "between feeling sorry for someone and—" He stopped, started again. "I know what I feel, Clara. I'm not entirely certain what to do with it yet, but I know what it is." She looked at him for a long moment. The restaurant moved around them. Dishes arriving at other tables, conversations. She couldn't hear the life of the room going on in its ordinary way, and she sat inside all of it and looked at the face of a man who had bought her for $2 and handed her back to herself in the month since. "All right," she said. "Not agreement, not surrender. Just all right. Proceed. I'm listening." And Nate understood, because he had been learning her language for 2 months, that it was the closest thing to trust she had yet extended, and that it was more than enough to work with. They rode back to Willow Creek on Thursday, and by Saturday morning, the ranch had resumed its rhythm. Cal's daily report, Thomas and the younger hands rotating through the livestock work, Douglas defending the sanctity of his kitchen against all comers. But something had shifted imperceptibly in the quality of the routine. A new seriousness had settled over the operation, because everyone on the property knew now that there was a threat from outside, and everyone was doing what people did in a working community. When something threatened the whole, they closed the distance between themselves. Peterson had gone quiet, not reformed exactly, but subdued, which was a reasonable substitute for now. Douglas had started leaving the inventory notes Clara made him in a specific spot on the counter, rather than crumpling them, which was his version of accommodation. Cal had begun addressing his weekly reports to both Nate and Clara, which had required visible effort, but which he was sustaining. Thomas, for his part, had taken it upon himself to learn Clara's hand signals, with the dedication of a young man who had decided that a skill was worth acquiring, because the person who used it was worth knowing. He could now receive and transmit a working vocabulary of about 40 signs, which made him by a significant margin the most useful communication conduit on the property. It was Thomas who came to find her on the Tuesday after their return from Denver while she was reviewing the east fence line notes. He was not running, but he was moving with the particular controlled urgency of someone who has decided that running would be alarming, but that normal walking speed is insufficient. She looked up. Thomas signed first. He had developed the habit, understanding that it was more reliable than speaking for getting her attention at a distance, and then spoke when she was looking at his face. "There's a man at the front gate," he said. "Rode in about 10 minutes ago. Asked for Mr. Caldwell by name. Cal told him to wait." A pause. "He's not from around here, ma'am. Clothes are wrong for a ranch hand and wrong for a townie. He's got the look of—" Thomas hesitated, searching for the word. "Like someone sent him. You know what I mean? Like he didn't come on his own idea." Clara set down her notebook. "Where's Nate?" "South pasture. Cal sent a rider." "What does this man look like?" Thomas described him mid-40s, well-dressed in the way of a city professional, trying to look like he traveled regularly, a leather satchel that he hadn't put down since he arrived. "Documents," Clara said. Thomas blinked. "Ma'am." "He's carrying documents," she said. "Formal delivery. Someone sent him." She paused. "Did he give a name?" Said he was from the Territorial Commissioner's office in Denver. Clara looked at Thomas for a moment. Not surprised, not alarmed, thinking. "Go get Nate," she said. "Don't let that man in the house until Nate is back." Thomas went. Clara walked to the front of the property and found the man from the Territorial Commissioner's office standing at the gate with the patient-practiced ease of someone accustomed to being kept waiting because the documents he carried made the wait worthwhile. He saw her coming. His eyes moved over her with the quick cataloging look of someone assembling useful information, and she saw the moment he decided she was not what he'd been waiting for. "I'm here to see Nathaniel Caldwell," he said. "I know," Clara said. "He'll be here shortly." She looked at the satchel. "In the meantime, I'm going to need you to tell me who authorized the delivery." The man's expression shifted into the careful blankness of a professional keeping his opinions to himself. "I'm not at liberty to—" "Gerald Whitmore," Clara said. "Or someone above him. My guess is above him, because Whitmore would have sent a county courier, not someone from the territorial office." She watched his face. "The railroad company, then. One of the Denver lines." The man was very still. "Which one?" Clara said. He said nothing. "All right," she said. "You don't have to tell me. You're going to hand those documents to Mr. Caldwell, and we're going to read them, and then Mr. Caldwell's attorney in Denver is going to begin requesting the communication records between the Territorial Commissioner's office and any railroad interests that have filed route surveys in the Northern Territory in the last 3 years. It'll take a few weeks longer that way." She paused. Or you could tell me now and we can all save the time." The man looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression of someone encountering something he hadn't prepared for. Not hostility, which he could have handled, and not ignorance, which he had expected, but the specific quiet competence of someone who already knew most of what he was there to tell them. "Northern Continental Rail," he said, finally, quietly. Clara nodded. "Thank you," she said. Nate arrived 12 minutes later, dusty from the south pasture, Cal half a step behind. He looked at the man at the gate, then at Clara standing beside him with her arms folded and her notebook open. "What do we have?" Nate said. "Formal survey correction notice from the Territorial Commissioner," Clara said. "Filed by Northern Continental Rail through Whitmore's office." She looked at Nate steadily. "They moved faster than Moore expected. We have 45 days, not 60. Nate held her gaze. "Northern Continental." "Yes." He looked at the man from the territorial office who was now holding out the document with the resigned expression of someone who had arrived expecting a simple delivery and was leaving with the distinct impression that he had been the least informed person at his own meeting. Nate took the document. He read it standing at the gate. He read it twice, which was what he did when what he read required sitting with before responding to. Then he folded it and put it in his coat and looked at Cal. "Get me Thomas," he said, "and get a horse ready. I need to ride to Willow Creek." "For the telegraph," Cal said. "For more," Nate said. "And then we need to talk to every rancher whose eastern boundary touches ours." He looked at the man from the territorial office who was now clearly ready to leave. "You can go," he told him. He waited until this man had mounted and turned his horse and ridden back toward the main road before he turned to Clara. She was already writing in her notebook. "You got the name out of him," Nate said. "I wasn't supposed to give it," Clara said, still writing. "Which means he didn't want to be complicit in something he'd been told was straightforward. People like that can be persuaded." She looked up. Northern Continental has filed 3 route surveys in the last 2 years. All of them dead-ended at the Northern Pass. They've been trying to get access to that corridor since the line reached Fort Collins. Nate was looking at her with the expression she had come to recognize, the one that arrived when she said something that moved the known boundaries of the situation. "You knew that already," he said, "before the man got here." "I suspected it," she said. "I wired Moore's office yesterday to pull the rail survey filings. Thomas wrote it in." She looked at Nate. "I should have told you before the man arrived. I'm sorry. The timing." "Don't apologize," he said. His voice was firm, but not unkind. "Clara, don't apologize for working ahead of the problem." She held his gaze. "You've been doing that since you got here," he said. "Working ahead of the problem. Watching things nobody else is watching. Finding things nobody else found. He paused. I need you to stop thinking of yourself as someone who works for this ranch. She looked at him carefully. What am I then? He held her gaze for a steady moment. Someone this ranch doesn't work without, he said. The words landed differently than he probably intended, or maybe exactly as he intended, because he was a man who chose his words the way he chose everything, with precision and without waste. She felt them settle somewhere she hadn't known was waiting to receive them. She looked back down at her notebook. Then let's get to work, she said. And 45 days. 45 days in which the future of 12,000 acres, 3 creek crossings, a northern pass, and 2 people who had started something neither of them had a word for, yet had just begun to run. The 45 days did not move slowly. Nate rode out. The morning after, the territorial courier left and didn't come back until near dark, and when he did come back, he had spoken to 4 neighboring ranchers' men whose eastern boundaries touched or nearly touched the Caldwell land, men who had received their own versions of Whitmore's survey correction notice and had been sitting on them in the particular isolated silence of people who believed their problem was theirs alone. He came through the front door and went straight to the office where Clara was still working, and he stood in the doorway until she looked up. How many? She said. 4 confirmed, he said. 2 more I couldn't reach today. Briggs Ranch Henderson, the Ortega family on the South Creek, and old Walt Pruitt, who's been running cattle up near the pass for 30 years. He sat down across from her. Every single one of them got a letter. Different language, same mechanism. Whitmore told each of them the dispute was specific to their parcel, made each one think they were the only one dealing with it. Clara set her pencil down. So they wouldn't talk to each other. So they wouldn't talk to each other, Nate said. Divide them, and they're manageable. Each family thinking they've got a private problem dealing with it privately, probably considering whether it's cheaper to just give up the disputed acreage and move on. He looked at her. But if they knew... They'd fight, Clara said. They'd fight, Nate said. Together. She was already reaching for a fresh page in her notebook. You need to bring them all in one room. That's what I was thinking. Weekend after next here if they'll come. They'll come, Clara said. Walt Pruitt alone has been trying to get someone to listen to his boundary complaint for 8 months. You tell him there are 4 others and a lawyer from Denver with documentation, he'll ride through a blizzard to get here. Nate almost smiled. You know Walt Pruitt. I know the type, she said. Stubborn, proud, and so used to being dismissed that the moment someone takes him seriously, he becomes your most committed ally. She paused. Treat him with respect, and you'll have him for life. Nate looked at her for a moment. Is that what happened with you? She looked up from her notebook. The question was asked quietly, without performance, the way he asked the real questions, without warning and without softening. No, she said. What happened with me was different. I wasn't looking for an ally. I was looking for a way to survive. She held his gaze. What you did was different from treating me with respect. What was it then? You treated me like I was already worth it, she said, before I'd done a single thing to prove it. That's not the same as respect. That's something harder to come by. The silence between them held the weight of that for a moment. Then Nate said, wire Moore tomorrow. Tell him we need him here for the meeting, not in Denver. Already planned, Clara said, and went back to writing. Moore arrived on the Thursday before the meeting, riding in from the stage with 2 leather cases and the slightly rumpled authority of a man who worked better under pressure than in comfort. He reviewed everything Clara had assembled, all the documents, her coordinate analysis, the rail survey filings Thomas had retrieved from the territorial archive, and he sat with it for 2 hours without saying much. When he finally looked up, he said, Miss Whitlock, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. All right, she said. In your time working for the land attorney in Pueblo, what was his name? Garrett, she said. Daniel Garrett. Did Garrett know you were doing more than filing? She considered that. He knew I was sharp, she said. He didn't know how much I was absorbing because he didn't look closely enough to find out. And if he had, he probably would have paid me more and given me less access, she said. Men in positions of authority usually do when they realize the person they've underestimated has caught up to them. Moore sat with that for a moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not for something I did specifically, but for the general category of assumption." "You're here and you're working," Clara said. "That's the apology." Moore almost smiled. "All right." He turned back to the documents. "Here's what we have, and here's what we need. We have the coordinate discrepancy solid. We have Perry's payment records solid, though circumstantial without testimony. We have the rail survey filings connecting Northern Continental to the past good context, but not legally actionable on its own." He aligned 3 pages on the desk. "What we need is Perry on the record. If he testifies that someone directed him to adjust those coordinates, and if we can connect the direction to either Whitmore or Northern Continental's agents, we have a case that will hold in territorial court." "Can you get to Perry?" Nate asked. "I've already sent a man to Pueblo," Moore said. "Perry's been cooperative with the category of people who make cooperation seem preferable to the alternative." He looked at Clara. "Your instinct was right. He's a coward. My man got 3 sentences out of him in the first meeting before he started asking about immunity." "He'll testify," Clara said. "He'll testify," Moore agreed. "The question is whether we can protect him long enough to get him to the hearing. Because if Northern Continental figures out we have Perry talking, they'll find a way to make him stop talking." The room went quiet. Nate looked at Moore. "How do we protect him?" "We move fast," Moore said. "We get the ranchers organized this weekend. We file for an emergency injunction to halt Whitmore's survey correction before the 45 days run out, and we get Perry's deposition taken before anyone knows we have him." He paused. "Which means this meeting on Saturday needs to produce a unified agreement. I cannot walk into the territorial court with 6 separate complaints from 6 separate landowners. I need one consolidated filing, one voice, one legal action." "Then we get one," Nate said. The meeting on Saturday brought 7 ranchers to the Caldwell Ranch, arriving in 1s and 2s through the morning. Walt Pruitt came first, as Clara had predicted, riding in an hour early and tying his horse with the air of a man who had been waiting years for exactly this kind of gathering. The Ortega family. Roberto and his wife Maria, who ran their South Creek land with a practical efficiency that Clara had heard Cal describe with involuntary admiration, came next. Maria carrying a covered dish that she set on the kitchen table without asking whether there was room, because there was always room. Cal organized the practical side of things with the quiet competence of a man in his element. Thomas kept coffee moving. Douglas, who had been informed that this was a working meeting and not a social call, made an exception to his usual kitchen sovereignty and produced enough food for 12 without being asked. Clara sat at the corner of the main table, where she could see every face in the room. When they were all settled, Nate stood up. He didn't make a speech. He wasn't a man who made speeches. He stated facts, what the letters meant, what Whitmore had done, how it connected to Northern Continental Rail, and what the coordinated strategy looked like if they moved together. He spoke for 10 minutes. When he finished, he sat back down. Walt Pruitt was the first to speak. He was 71 years old, deeply weathered with the direct and undecorated speech of a man who had run cattle alone for so long that he had lost patience for anything that wasn't the point. "They told me my survey complaint was a record-keeping error," he said. "I've been telling the county office for 8 months it wasn't a record-keeping error. They said I didn't understand how survey documents worked." "You understood fine," Clara said. Every head in the room turned to her. She had not planned to speak first. But Walt Pruitt had said what he said with the specific bitterness of someone who had been told repeatedly that their understanding of their own situation was wrong, and that was a kind of wrong she understood from the inside. She looked at him directly. "You understood fine," she said again. "The error in your survey isn't an error. It was placed there deliberately, the same way it was placed in Mr. Caldwell's documents, and the Hendersons, and every other parcel in this room. The only thing wrong with your understanding was that you were looking for an honest explanation, and there wasn't one." Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. "Who are you?" he said. "Clara Whitlock," she said. "I manage the ranch records." "She's the one who found the coordinate manipulation," Moore said from the other end of the table. "In the original survey documents. Everything we know about Whitmore's plan came from her analysis." Pruitt looked at her for another moment with the measuring look of a man who had been alive long enough to be a fair judge of people. Then he nodded a single slow nod that carried more weight than most men's signatures. "All right," he said. "What do we do?" That was the moment the room changed. The question opened a door, and everyone in that room walked through it together. And what had been 7 separate, isolated grievances became something unified and forward-moving and alive. Moore laid out the consolidated filing. The ranchers asked good questions, sharp, practical, the questions of people who worked land and understood consequence. Maria Ortega asked the most precise questions of anyone in the room, which Clara noted, and which she thought Moore also noted, because he started directing a portion of his explanation toward her specifically. Roberto Ortega said very little, but he signed where he was asked to sign with the deliberate finality of a man who had made his decision and was not revisiting it. By early afternoon, they had 6 signatures on Moore's consolidated complaint. The 7th, a rancher named Delaney, who had ridden in late and cautious, held back at the end of the formal session and stood in the doorway as the others were taking their leave. Clara saw him from across the room, saw the set of his shoulders, the particular posture of someone carrying a conflict he hadn't resolved. She walked over to him. How was a man in his 50s, compact and careful, with the eyes of someone who had learned that situations usually had a more expensive layer underneath the first one. "Mr. Delaney," she said. He looked at her. He'd been making the effort all morning to face her when he spoke, which she noticed and appreciated. "Miss Whitlock." A pause. "I want to sign. I do. But my eldest boy, he works a contract with Northern Continental. Grading crew. It's good work and it's steady, and if I put my name on that paper—" "They might threaten his contract," Clara said. "Or end it outright," Delaney said. "And I got no right to make that decision for him." Clara looked at him. "Does your son know what Northern Continental is doing to your land?" Delaney's jaw tightened. "No." "Then maybe," she said carefully, "he should have the information before either of you decides anything." She paused. "A man who works honestly for a company that operates dishonestly deserves to know the whole picture. What he does with it is his choice. But it should be his choice, made with the full truth, not half of it." Delaney was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You reckon he'd quit?" "I don't know your son," Clara said. "But I know that most men who work honestly don't like discovering they've been someone's instrument." She looked at him steadily. "Bring him to talk to Mr. Moore before the filing date. If he understands the situation and still wants to keep the contract, that's a decision to respect. But give him the chance to decide." 3 days later, Delaney rode in with his son, a young man of about 25 named James, who listened to Moore for 45 minutes with increasing and visible anger, and who signed the consolidated complaint before he left the ranch with the expression of a man who had just rearranged his understanding of several things at once. That was 11 days into the 45. They were moving. But Whitmore was moving too. The first sign came from Thomas, who had ridden into Willow Creek for supplies on a Wednesday, and came back with the particular tight-jawed expression of someone who had heard something in town that they hadn't known how to respond to. He found Clara in the east yard. He waited until she was looking at him, then signed and spoke together. His standard approach now, fast and efficient. "There's talk in town," he said. "About you. About what's happening with the survey case." Clara waited. "Dunner," Thomas said. "The auctioneer. He's been telling people that Mr. Caldwell bought you because—" He stopped. He was 18 and decent, and the sentence clearly caused him to continue. "He's saying it isn't proper. What's happening here? That a woman in your situation influencing a land case." He stopped again. "He's saying you got influence over Mr. Caldwell that isn't appropriate," Clara said flatly. Thomas looked at her with the misery of someone who had hoped to not have to say the word. "Yes, ma'am." She absorbed it. She had been waiting for something like this. Not this specifically, but the shape of it. When a woman with no social standing began to have visible effect on the affairs of powerful men, the response from people who wanted her stopped was almost always the same. You didn't attack her competence. You attacked her character. "How many people is Dunner telling this to?" she asked. "It was at the general store when I was there," Thomas said. There were maybe 8-10 people. And their response? Thomas hesitated. Some of them were nodding. She thanked him and went to find Nate. I was in the stable when she found him working on a harness with the focused, slightly removed quality of a man doing physical work because his mind needed somewhere uncomplicated to put itself. He heard her, felt her, actually the vibration of her footsteps on the stable floor, and looked up before she reached him. She told him what Thomas had said. All of it. Direct and without softening, because she had learned that softening information for Nate was something he neither needed nor wanted. His face went through something while she spoke, not anger exactly, but the controlled internal version of it that sat just below anger in a man who had learned to process his reactions before releasing them. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dunner." "It doesn't matter who specifically," Clara said. "It was going to be someone. We're threatening a railroad contract and a county commissioner's operation. They need to discredit the source." "You're the source," Nate said. "I'm the easiest target," she said. "A deaf woman who was auctioned for $2 and is now influencing a major land case. Dunner doesn't have to work very hard to make that sound like something it isn't." Nate set down the harness. He looked at her with a steadiness that she had learned meant he was making a decision rather than considering one. "I'm going into Willow Creek." "Nate." "Not to have a fight," he said. "To have a conversation, publicly." He held her gaze. "Dunner wants to make this about what you are. I'm going to make it about what you've done. Those are two different conversations, and only one of them is true." She looked at him. "You don't have to defend me." "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's not why I'm doing it." The quality of that statement, not obligation, not chivalry, but something that lived in the territory of genuine conviction, sat between them for a moment. She said, "Be careful how you do it. If you come in angry, it confirms the story. If you come in calm and bring facts," conducted most of his social business, because it provided the largest consistent audience. Nate walked in, bought a tin of coffee and a pound of salt, and then turned to the room at large with the ease of a man who had never in his life been uncertain about whether he was allowed to speak. "I hear there's been some talk," he said, "about Miss Whitlock and the survey case." The store went the particular quiet of people who had been discussing exactly that, and were now pretending they hadn't. Dunner was behind a barrel of flour. He had the look of a man deciding whether to be bold or careful, and the calculation was visible on his face. "Just observing," Dunner said, "that it's unusual. A woman in that kind of position." "What position is that?" Nate said. "Influencing a legal matter," Dunner said. "A woman who came to you from a public auction." "A woman," Nate said, "who identified a fraudulent coordinate manipulation in 3 survey documents that my Denver attorney had filed without catching for 15 years. Who connected the manipulation to a county clerk with 3 documented irregular payments. Who made the connection to Northern Continental Rail before anyone else in the territory did." He paused. "If you want to talk about unusual, Horace, let's talk about a railroad company that's been planting false survey data across the Northern Territory for 8 years. That's the unusual part. Miss Whitlock is just the person who read it clearly." The store was very quiet. Dunner's face had gone through several colors. "Be that as it may," he said, "the question of her position." "Her position," Nate said, "is that she works for Caldwell Ranch, and she's exceptionally good at what she does. That is the only position relevant to a land case." He picked up his tin and his salt. "Anyone who finds that difficult to credit is welcome to review the documents themselves. Moore's filing is public record." He looked at Dunner directly for one steady moment. "I'd recommend people spend more time on that and less time on speculation." He walked out. He rode back to the ranch and told Clara what had happened. She listened to all of it and then said, "The store will talk about nothing else for 3 days." "Probably," Nate said. "And at the end of 3 days, people will have sorted themselves," she said. "The ones who are persuadable will have been persuaded. The ones who aren't won't be moved by any amount of documentation." "That's usually how it goes," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at him. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. I told the truth. The truth should have been told sooner. She held his gaze for a moment, that searching, complete look that she gave when she was reading what was underneath a person's words. Whatever she found, she didn't name it. She simply nodded and went back to her work, and Nate stood in the office doorway for a moment longer than necessary before he went back to his. The injunction hearing was set for a Thursday 3 weeks out. Moore had pushed for the earliest possible date and gotten it largely because the territorial court judge, a man named Arbery, who had been on the bench for 20 years and had seen enough land fraud to recognize the shape of it, quickly had read the consolidated filing and called Moore's office the following morning. He read it himself, Moore told Nate when he wired with the date. Same day it was filed. That doesn't happen unless something in the filing compelled his personal attention. What compelled it? Nate wired back. Moore's response came the next morning. The coordinate analysis. Arbery said in his 20 years, he has never seen a fraudulent survey manipulation documented with that precision. He wants the person who did the analysis available for the hearing. Nate read the wire at the breakfast table. He slid it across to Clara without comment. She read it. She set it down. She picked up her coffee. I'll need a different dress, she said. Nate looked at her. Then he said, Thomas, ride into town today and speak to Mrs. Henderson at the dressmaker. Tell her what's needed and when. Thomas left within the hour. But the day before Thomas returned from town, the thing happened that none of them had anticipated. Not because they hadn't considered the possibility of interference, but because the form it took was not what any of them expected. It began with the weather. Colorado in late summer built its storms fast and without the long warning that gave experienced ranchers time to prepare. The sky went wrong in the early afternoon, not green-gray this time, but the flat yellow-white that meant rotation, that meant something more serious than hail. Cal looked at it from the south pasture and rode back hard. He found Nate in the yard. We got trouble coming, Cal said, not stopping his horse. Bad trouble. That formation over the ridge. I see it, Nate said. Henderson's crew is still out on the far east pasture, Cal said. They were checking the boundary markers Moore asked us to photograph the physical landmarks for the hearing. 3 of their men and 2 of ours. Nate looked at the sky. How long? 40 minutes, Cal said. Maybe less. Get everyone in, Nate said. Now, send Thomas to the east pasture. Thomas is in town. Nate stopped. Who's fastest on a horse? Cal said a name one of the younger hands, and that man was mounted and riding within 3 minutes. Nate turned to the stable, and Clara was already there, already moving toward the horses, with the particular focused economy of someone who had made a decision and was executing it. Clara, Nate said sharply. She turned. She could not hear the urgency in his voice, but she could read it in his face. No, he said. The east pasture is 6 miles. If that storm turns... The boundary markers, she said. Moore needs photographs and written coordinate confirmations. The markers are what tie the physical land to the documents. If we don't have them, we can get them after. After a storm hits those markers, we may not be able to confirm which position they were in before the storm. She held his gaze. Whitmore's team has been out to that boundary twice in the last 2 weeks. Nate, if those markers get moved during a storm and we have no prior confirmation of their position... He understood. He understood immediately because she was right. Not alone, he said. Then come with me, she said. They rode hard for the east pasture, and the sky pressed down behind them the whole way, and Nate knew in the way of a man who had worked this land for 20 years that 40 minutes had been an optimistic estimate. They reached the Henderson boundary in just under 30 minutes. The 2 Caldwell hands and the 3 Henderson men were still there, and they had managed 3 photographs with the equipment Moore had sent and documented 2 markers in writing, but the remaining 4 markers on the northern line had not been confirmed. Get out, Nate told the hands. All of you, straight back to the ranch. Sir. Now, Nate said. The men rode. Clara was already at the first northern marker, her notebook out, writing fast position physical description. The carved notation on the post. Face the distance and bearing to the Creek Junction reference point. She worked with the speed of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment, which she had been because she had studied Moore's documentation requirements until she could recite them from memory. Nate confirmed the details verbally, reading the marker to her so she could transcribe without losing time, looking up and down. It was the most efficient system, his eyes and voice, her hands and precision, and they moved through the first marker and the second in under 10 minutes. The sky broke open on the third marker. Not gradually. Not with warning. It simply broke the way Colorado storms broke when they meant business, and the rain came horizontal, and the wind came with it, like something that had been waiting, and Nate grabbed Clara's arm before she lost her footing on the suddenly treacherous ground. She pulled away, not in fear in purpose. She was still writing. She had the third marker's position, and she needed the fourth. Clara. He had to lean to her ear, the only way to communicate when she couldn't see his face, and the rain was blinding both of them. We have to move. She held up 4 fingers. One more. I understood. He grabbed her arm again, not to stop her, but to move with her, and they crossed the 15 yards to the fourth marker together. Half blind, the wind pushing against them with the physical insistence of something trying to make a point. She went down on one knee in front of the marker post, and he crouched beside her, and they read it together, him shouting the numbers into her ear, her writing with a hand she was shielding against her body to keep the notebook dry. They got it. She snapped the notebook shut, and he pulled her up, and they turned toward the horses and the structure that had been standing at the edge of the marker field, an old claim shelter left from the previous survey team, chose that moment to come apart. It came apart loudly, and it came apart fast. And the section of roof that swung down came down at an angle that Nate had about half a second to recognize as dangerous before it caught him across the right side, his shoulder, his ribs, the side of his head, and put him on the ground. Clara heard none of it. She turned because she felt the vibration of the impact through the ground, and she turned in time to see Nate down. Not unconscious, not quite, but down, and not getting up in the way of a man who intended to get up under his own power. She was beside him before she had decided to move. Nate. She got her hands on his face and made him look at her. His eyes were focused but wrong, the slight delay of a man whose body was having a conversation his mind hadn't caught up to yet. He started. Don't, she said. Don't tell me you're fine. Look at me. Track my hand. She moved her right hand. His eyes followed. Slow. Too slow. Can you stand? She said. I can stand, he said. He tried. The sound he made when he tried told her the ribs were involved, the sharp involuntary intake that a person made when bone moved in a direction bone was not supposed to move. He could not stand. Not without help. Not in any way that would get him 6 miles back to the ranch. The horses were still tied. Barely the wind had them terrified and pulling, and Clara moved to them fast, untied them, and brought Nate's horse as close to him as the animal's fear would allow. Nate looked up at her from the ground. She could read his face clearly enough even in the storm and the low light. The specific expression of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the one who solved problems for other people, and had just found himself unable to solve the most immediate and practical one in front of him. Clara, he said, get on your horse and go. She didn't let him finish. She crouched in front of him, got her shoulder under his left arm, and stood up. Howe was taller than her and outweighed her by a considerable margin, and the wind was pushing at both of them, and his right side was compromised, so he couldn't push off effectively. And none of that mattered, because she had made a decision, and she was implementing it. Up, she said. Clara, you cannot. Up, she said again. He stopped arguing. He used his left arm, and she used everything she had, and it took 2 attempts, and something she felt give slightly in her own left shoulder, before he was on his feet. Not steady, not functional, but vertical. She got him to his horse. He couldn't mount unaided. She positioned herself braced, and pushed him up with both arms, while he pulled with his left, and it was one of the ugliest things either of them had ever managed, and it worked, and he was in the saddle. She mounted her own horse. She rode in front, because the trail was barely visible now, and she needed him following her line, not making decisions about direction, in a state where decisions about direction were not something he should be trusted with. She kept looking back every 30 seconds, every minute, and every time she looked back, he was still there, still upright, holding the pommel with his good hand, and his face set against the pain, with the grim, determined blankness of a man refusing to add to a problem. The 6 miles took an hour and 40 minutes. Cal was at the stable entrance when they arrived, and his face when he saw Nate in the saddle upright, but barely went through 4 separate expressions in the space of a single second, ending at the version of controlled alarm that was his operational mode under pressure. "Get the doc," Clara said. She was off her horse before it fully stopped, and she was at Nate's side before Cal had finished his first question, and she had her hands on Nate's arm before he could try to dismount unaided. "I can," Nate started. "Thomas is still in town," Cal said. "I'll send—" "Ride yourself," Clara said. "Faster." She looked at Cal with the specific directness she used when speed mattered. 3 ribs at minimum, possible head injury. Go. Cal went. They got Nate inside and onto the long bench in the main room, and Douglas materialized from the kitchen without being asked, and produced the medical kit that lived in the cupboard above the flour, because Douglas had been on working ranches long enough to know that cupboard was the one that mattered. Peterson, of all people, appeared in the doorway and asked without any of his former edge whether he should stay or go, and Clara told him to stay and hold the lamp. He held the lamp. She worked with the medical kit, with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, checking each rib by touch, watching Nate's face for the involuntary reactions that told her what she needed to know, since he was not going to tell her voluntarily. He watched her work without speaking, which was unusual for him, and which told her the pain was worse than he was performing. "How bad?" he said finally. She looked at his face. 2 ribs, maybe 3, she said. "The head injury is concussion. Mild, I think, but the doctor needs to confirm that." "The markers," he said. "Did we get all 4? She looked at him. "Yes." Something went out of his face, the particular tension of a man who had been holding a secondary concern under the primary one. "Good," he said. "Don't talk," she said. "Clara. Nate." She met his eyes. "Stop talking." He stopped. He lay back against the bench and he looked at the ceiling, and she sat beside him with her hand wrapped around his wrist. Not from any medical necessity, simply because she was there, and because her presence was the only thing she had to offer in the space between what had happened and what came next. His pulse was steady. His breathing was controlled. He was going to be all right. She knew that. But she sat there anyway, her thumb against the inside of his wrist, feeling the proof of it. Steady, steady, steady. Because the 6 miles back through the storm had cost her something she hadn't known she had left to give, and she needed to know he was still here. After a while she felt his hand turn under hers, and his fingers close around it. She didn't pull away. They sat in the lamplight while the storm finished its business outside, and Peterson held the lamp without saying a word, and Douglas appeared with something hot that neither of them touched, and the ranch settled around them the way a ranch settled when the crisis had passed, and the work of surviving it was simply being very still and breathing. The doctor arrived 40 minutes later. He confirmed 2 cracked ribs and a mild concussion, recommended 3 days of rest that Nate immediately stated he would reduce to 1.5, and looked at the bandaging Clara had done with the expression of a professional who had expected worse and found competent work instead. "You do this?" he asked Clara. "Yes," she said. "Where'd you learn field dressing?" "A ranch teaches you," she said. The doctor looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded, gathered his bag, and went to discuss the care instructions with Cal, because he was experienced enough to know that the person who would actually enforce them was not the patient. When they were alone, Nate looked at her from the bench. "You dragged me through 6 miles of that storm," he said. "You were moving under your own power," she said. "Mostly." "Clara." She looked at him. "I need to say something," he said. "You have a concussion," she said. "You should—" "I know what I have," he said. "I also know what I'm going to say, and I need to say it while I'm not trying to be careful about it." He held her gaze. "I have been trying for 3 months to identify what is happening between us in a way that fits inside what I think I'm allowed to feel. I keep talking myself out of it because of the $2, and because you work for me, and because I don't know what you want, and I'm afraid of being wrong about all of it." She was very still. "But I was on the ground back there," he said, "and you were the person who got me up. Not because it was your job. Not because you owed me anything. Because you chose to." His voice had the quality of a man who was saying exactly what he meant with no decoration around it. "You've been choosing this whole time. Every morning you get up and you choose to be here and to do the work and to stay. I see it. And if I spend another 3 months pretending I don't know what that means to me, I'm going to be the biggest fool in Colorado." The room was very quiet. Clara looked at him, at this man on a bench with 2 cracked ribs and a concussion, telling her the truth about himself, with the particular courage of someone who had decided that the cost of honesty was lower than the cost of silence. She thought about the auction platform. She thought about $2. She thought about the morning she had walked into the office and found the coordinate discrepancy, and known with the certainty she brought to everything she analyzed, that what she had found was real. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not the end of something or the beginning of something. It was a fact stated in her direct and undecorated way, offered to a man who needed facts more than poetry. But his face when she said it told her that it was enough. Outside, the storm was already moving east. The Colorado sky did what it always did. After it finished, it cleared fast and cold and completely, as if it had made its point and saw no reason to belabor it. Inside the main room of the Caldwell Ranch, 2 people sat in the settling lamplight, one of them with 2 cracked ribs and one of them with a shoulder that would be sore for a week, and the hearing in territorial court was 12 days away, and Gerald Whitmore had no idea what was coming. But they did. Nate took 1 day of rest. Not 3, not 2, 1. Clara knew he would do exactly this, and she had stopped arguing about it the previous evening when she recognized the particular set of his jaw that meant the decision was already made and discussion was overhead. She wasn't going to recover. What she did instead was make the 1 day count. She came to him the morning after the storm with her notebook, the consolidated documents, and Moore's preparation notes for the hearing, and she sat across from him, and they worked through everything, every argument, every piece of evidence, every likely countermove from Whitmore's legal team for 6 hours straight. She made him eat twice. She sent Douglas in with coffee every hour because she had learned that Nate thought more clearly when his hands were occupied, and coffee gave his hands something to do when they weren't allowed to be working. Cal appeared in the doorway at midday and looked at the 2 of them buried in paper and said, "This is his idea of rest." "It's the best I could negotiate," Clara said without looking up. Cal made a sound that was not quite a laugh and withdrew. Nate looked at Clara across the desk, and his mouth moved into the thing that was no longer almost a smile, but simply a smile, unguarded and direct, and she looked back at her notebook before it could do what it was threatening to do to her composure. The hearing was in 11 days. They needed every one of them. Moore arrived back at the ranch on the 4th day with news that changed the shape of everything, and he delivered it at the breakfast table, because that was where decisions happened at the Caldwell Ranch now, and he had been on the property long enough to understand the operational geography. He sat down, accepted the coffee Thomas put in front of him, and said, "Perry gave us more than I expected." Clara looked up. "He didn't just confirm the coordinate adjustment," Moore said. "He confirmed that he received specific written instructions, not verbal written, describing exactly which coordinates to change and by what margin. He kept the letter." He paused. "He kept it for 8 years because he was afraid to destroy it and afraid to use it, and when my man sat down with him in Pueblo and explained what immunity looked like, he went to a lockbox under his floorboards and produced it." The table was very quiet. "A letter," Nate said. "From who?" "Signed by a man named Richard Holt," Moore said. "Who is or was the Western Territory Acquisitions Director for Northern Continental Rail." Clara set down her pencil. He died in 1876, Moore said. "Which is why Northern Continental thought this was airtight. Their man is dead." Perry was quiet. The documents looked clean. He looked at Clara. They didn't account for someone reading the documents closely enough to find the seam. Nate said, "Does the letter connect Whitmore?" "Not directly," Moore said. "Holt is dead, and Whitmore came after. But..." He reached into his leather case and produced a document. I pulled Northern Continental's internal land acquisition filings from the Territorial Commerce Office. They're public record technically, though. Nobody looks at them because they run to several hundred pages and require cross-referencing 3 separate ledgers to extract anything meaningful. He set the document on the table and looked at Clara. I thought this might be your kind of work. She took it. She started reading immediately, and Nate watched her eyes move across the page with the focused speed of a woman who could extract the essential from the dense because she had spent her whole life learning to find signal inside noise. How long do I have? She said, not looking up. Hearing is in 11 days, Moore said. Perry's testimony and the Holt letter established the original fraud. If we can connect Northern Continental's current acquisition strategy to Whitmore's actions, show that his survey correction filing is a continuation of the same scheme, not an independent regulatory action, then we're not just defending a boundary. We're exposing a coordinated land fraud operation that spans a decade and multiple counties. That's a much larger case, Nate said. It's the case we actually have, Moore said. The question is whether we can build it in 11 days. Clara looked up from the document. 10, she said. You need a day before the hearing to prepare your presentation. Give me 10. Moore looked at her. 10 days to cross-reference several hundred pages of corporate land filings against 8 years of county survey actions. 9, she said. I want the 10th day to check my own work. Moore looked at Nate. Nate looked at Clara. Neither of them said anything that resembled an argument. Thomas, Nate said. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway because Thomas had developed the habit of being near enough to be called without being in the room uninvited, which was a quality that made him increasingly indispensable. Clear the east office, Nate said. Move the supply ledgers out. Put the good lamp in there. Miss Whitlock is going to need the table space and she's going to need quiet. Thomas was moving before Nate finished the sentence. What happened in the East office over the following 9 days was something that several people on the ranch would describe later, each in their own way, but which none of them fully understood while it was happening. Clara worked with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had found her exact purpose and was applying every capacity she possessed to it. She slept 4 or 5 hours. She ate at the table when Thomas brought food, and sometimes didn't notice he had until the plate was cold. She covered 3 full notebooks with cross-referenced entries, built a timeline that ran across 6 sheets of paper, joined end to end, and on the 7th day found something that made her sit very still for 10 full minutes before she stood up and walked down the hall to find more. Howe was in the main office reviewing his courtroom notes. She came in without knocking. She sometimes forgot to knock. Not from rudeness, but because the habit required hearing yourself approach, and she never did, and set 3 sheets of paper on his desk. He looked at them. He looked at them again. Clara, he said slowly. Northern Continental filed a route survey in 1873, she said. 18 months before the first of Perry's irregular payments. The survey listed the Northern Pass as an obstacle terrain too unstable for reliable rail construction. That's in the filing. She pointed to the first sheet. But their internal acquisition ledger from the same year lists the Northern Pass corridor as a priority acquisition target category 1, which in their internal coding means essential, not optional. She pointed to the second sheet. They filed a public document saying the pass was an obstacle while simultaneously categorizing it internally as essential, which means they were never planning to go around it, Moore said. They were planning to acquire it. And they needed the land on either side cleared of competing claims before they could move, Clara said. The survey manipulation wasn't just about the creek water rights. It was about creating a legal mechanism to destabilize every major landholding along the pass corridor. Make the claims uncertain, make the owners defensive, make them expensive to fight and cheap to buy out. She set the third sheet down. There are 11 properties in the affected corridor. We have 6 ranchers filing with us. The other 5 have already sold, Moore said. He was reading the third sheet. Or are in negotiation. He looked up. At below market prices. Significantly below, Clara said. Because a property with a boundary dispute pending sells for considerably less than one without. Moore stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she waited because she knew the posture of a man processing the full scale of something. He turned around. "This isn't a boundary dispute case anymore." "No," she said. "This is a federal fraud case," he said. "Railroad land fraud falls under territorial federal jurisdiction. If I present this to Judge Arbery, he refers it to the federal circuit," Clara said. "Which means Whitmore doesn't just lose the survey correction. He faces federal conspiracy charges. And Northern Continental's Colorado land acquisitions are frozen pending investigation." Moore looked at her for a long moment. "You understand what this means for the hearing?" "It changes everything," she said. "It changes everything," he agreed. "I need to restructure the entire presentation, which means I need 2 more days than I have." He looked at her. "Can you have the full cross-reference ready in 7 days instead of 9? "I can have it in 6, she said. "If Thomas helps me." "Done," Moore said. He was already reaching for his pen. She went back to the East office, and she worked through the next 6 days with Thomas beside her, the young man turning out to have a quick, organized mind that complemented her own. She identified the connections, and he tracked the page references and cross-checked the dates, and together they moved through the Northern Continental filings at a pace that would not have been possible alone. On the 5th of those 6 days, Nate came to the East office doorway at 9 in the evening. Thomas saw him and quietly gathered his things and left with the tact of a young man who was learning when his presence was and wasn't the point. Nate came in and sat down across from her. She was still writing. He waited until she looked up. "You need to sleep," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "You've said that for 3 days." "This time I mean it," she said. He looked at her, not with the exasperation of a man who felt dismissed, but with the particular attention of someone who had decided to see a thing clearly. "Are you all right?" She looked at him. It was the kind of question asked in the kind of way that did not mean, "Are you functioning?" It meant, "Are you actually all right underneath the functioning?" "I'm scared," she said. He didn't react with the automatic reassurance that most people reached for when someone admitted fear. He simply kept looking at her. "Of the hearing," she said. "I've built this case. I know it's right. But being right and being believed are 2 different things. And I know what happens when someone who looks like me in the situation I'm in walks into a courtroom." Nate was quiet for a moment. "What do you think happens? They look at you before they listen to you," she said. "And what they see affects what they're willing to hear. A deaf woman from a labor auction. A woman who works for the man who bought her." She said it plainly without self-pity, because she had never had the luxury of self-pity about the facts of her situation. "Whitmore's lawyer is going to use every one of those facts." "He's going to try," Nate said. "That's different from succeeding." "Is it?" "Judge Arbery read your coordinate analysis the day it was filed," Nate said. "He requested your presence at the hearing. He didn't ask for more. He didn't ask for me. He asked for the person who did the analysis." He held her gaze. "He's already listening." She was quiet. "You found something in those documents that 8 years of county clerks and land agents and lawyers all missed," Nate said. "You found it because you look at things the way you do, which is completely and without assumption. Arbery has been on the bench 20 years. He knows the difference between a woman who got lucky and a mind that works at a different level than what he's used to seeing." He paused. "He knows. Whatever Whitmore's lawyer tries, they'll try to discredit me personally," she said. "When the evidence is too solid to argue, you argue the source. It's the oldest technique." "Then we're ready for it," Nate said. "Moore has been preparing for it specifically." She looked at him. "You've been talking to Moore about this." "I asked him to prepare for it," Nate said. "Because you would be too busy doing the actual work to spend time on the defense of your own credibility." He said it without apology and without expectation of gratitude. "Simply this needed doing, so I did it." She held his gaze for a moment. The East office was quiet around them, the 6 joined sheets of paper running across the table between them. 11 days of work that had changed a boundary dispute into something with federal implications. "You've been taking care of this whole time," she said, "while I was in here." "You were doing the work that mattered," he said. "I was doing what was left." "That's not a small thing," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." The hearing was on a Thursday, and they rode into Willow Creek together. Nate and Clara and Moore with Cal driving the supply wagon that carried the document cases, and Thomas riding alongside, because he had asked if he could come, and nobody had found a sufficient reason to say no. The courthouse in Willow Creek was a two-story building that served also as the county records office, and on alternate Fridays, the location of the town council meetings. It had the slightly improvised quality of a building that had been asked to do more than it was originally designed for. But Judge Arbery's courtroom occupied the entire upper floor, and on a Thursday morning with a federal fraud case pending, it was full. The ranchers were there. Walt Pruitt in the front row, with the upright posture of a man who had waited 8 months for this seat. The Ortegas side by side with their hands folded. James Delaney next to his father, with the still raw expression of someone whose understanding of a former employer was recent and unhealed. The town was there too, people who had heard enough in 3 weeks of talk to know this was not a routine boundary hearing. Horace Dunner was in the back row, which Clara noted without expression when she walked in. Whitmore arrived with 2 lawyers, which was one more lawyer than Moore had expected, and which Moore absorbed with the brief controlled reaction of a man recalculating under pressure. Clara saw it. She leaned toward him and said, "Second chair is from Denver. Northern Continental sent their own counsel." Moore looked at her. "How do you know boots?" she said. "Ranch lawyers wear working boots. That man hasn't been closer to a ranch than a dinner party." Moore looked at the second lawyer's footwear, and then looked back at Clara, with an expression of pure professional appreciation. "Right," he said. "Northern Continental is here. Which means they know what we have." "Which means Perry is the immediate priority," Clara said. "If they've figured out we have his testimony, they haven't moved on him," Moore said quietly. "My man in Pueblo confirmed this morning. Perry is safe." He paused. "But the fact that Northern Continental sent counsel means they've seen the scope of the filing, and they know this isn't going to be contained at the county level." "Good," Clara said. "Let them know." Judge Arbery was a compact man of 62, with the careful, undramatic authority of someone who had spent 20 years being the most important person in rooms without needing anyone to say so. He came in, took his seat, looked at the assembled courtroom with the equanimity of a man who had seen considerably worse, and called the session to order. Moore opened. He was good. Clara had known he was good, but she watched him work the courtroom with the specific skill of a man who understood that a hearing was theater with consequences, and he calibrated the balance between legal precision and accessible narrative with the ease of long practice. He laid out the coordinate discrepancy, the Perry payments, the Holt letter. He laid out the survey manipulation as deliberate fraud documented and verifiable. Whitmore's lead lawyer, a smooth Denver man named Corwell, objected 3 times in the first 20 minutes. Arbery sustained none of them. He was listening. Clara could see it, genuinely listening in the way of a man who had decided this was worth his full attention and was giving it. Then Corwell stood for his opening and said without any particular theatrical emphasis, "Your Honor, before we address the substance of opposing counsel's claims, we'd like to raise the question of the primary source of these alleged findings, specifically the qualifications and circumstances of the individual who conducted the document analysis." Arbery looked at him. "You want to question the analyst before the analysis is presented. We believe the source bears directly on the reliability of the conclusions, Your Honor." Arbery looked at Moore. "Counselor, we welcome it," Moore said. "Miss Whitlock is prepared to speak to her methodology in full." Corwell had clearly not expected that answer. The slight recalibration in his expression was small, but Clara caught it because she caught everything. She was called. She walked to the position Moore had prepared her for and looked at Judge Arbery directly, rather than at the room. She had decided this on her own. She would speak to the judge, not to the audience. The judge was the only person whose opinion carried consequence. Arbery looked at her. "Miss Whitlock, I understand you have a hearing impairment." "I'm deaf, Your Honor," she said. "I read lips. If you and counsel face me directly when speaking, I'll have no difficulty following the proceeding." Arbery nodded. "Noted. Counsel will face the witness." He looked at Caldwell with a precision that suggested this was an instruction and not a suggestion. Caldwell stood. He faced her. And then he did what she had told Nate he would do. "Miss Whitlock, can you describe your formal education?" "I attended the county school in Pueblo through age 12, she said. "I am self-educated beyond that." "No formal legal training?" "No." "No formal surveying certification?" "No." "You came to Caldwell Ranch from a public labor auction," Caldwell said. "Is that correct?" "Yes." "And Mr. Caldwell paid $2 for your contract?" "Yes." Caldwell paused, letting it sit. Letting the room assemble whatever picture it was going to assemble from those facts. Then he said, "And it's your testimony that you, a self-educated deaf woman with no formal legal or surveying credentials, identified a document fraud that county clerks, licensed surveyors, and a Denver attorney with 15 years of professional practice all failed to detect." The courtroom was quiet. Clara looked at Caldwell steadily. "Yes," she said. "That's my testimony." Caldwell spread his hands slightly, the gesture of a man demonstrating an absurdity to an audience. "And how would you explain that?" "They weren't looking for it," Clara said. "I was." A small sound moved through the courtroom. Not quite laughter, something more like recognition. "And why were you looking for it?" Caldwell said. "Because I have spent my entire life in rooms where people assumed I had nothing to contribute," Clara said. Her voice was level and clear. "That assumption tends to make people careless about what they say and do around me. I've had 22 years of practice observing what people do when they think they're not being watched. I applied that same practice to documents that 8 years of professional oversight had stopped looking at carefully." She paused. "The coordinates don't change because of who finds them. They're wrong because they were deliberately made wrong. My background doesn't alter that fact." The courtroom was very still. Arbery was looking at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man encountering something that exceeded what he had expected and was making the internal adjustment. Caldwell tried 2 more approaches. He questioned the methodology of her cross-reference. She walked him through it step by step, with the patience and precision of someone who had checked her own work twice and knew exactly where every conclusion came from. He questioned the chain of custody on the Northern Continental internal documents. She cited the Territorial Commerce Office filing reference numbers from memory. After the 3rd approach, Caldwell sat down. Moore stood up. "Miss Whitlock, you identified a connection between the Northern Continental internal acquisition filings and the county survey manipulation. Can you walk the court through that connection?" She did. She spoke for 40 minutes. She used the joined sheets of paper, the 6-sheet timeline she and Thomas had built, mounted on a frame Moore had prepared, and she walked Judge Arbery through 8 years of coordinated land fraud with the methodical clarity of a woman who had organized this information until it was impossible to misread. When she finished, the courtroom was the quietest it had been all morning. Arbery looked at the timeline for a long moment. Then he said, "Counselor Moore, I want to see the Holt letter." Moore produced it. Arbery read it. He read it twice. Then he called a recess. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Moore turned to Clara and said in a low voice, "Caldwell is going to his client during this recess." "Northern Continental Council," Clara said. "Yes. They're deciding whether to let this continue or whether to move for settlement." Nate was standing beside Clara. He had said almost nothing since they entered the building, which was his way in situations that required other people to perform. He stayed back and let them perform. But he had been beside her the whole time, close enough that she could feel the actual physical presence of him, not touching, simply there, the particular quality of someone who intended to remain where they were, regardless of what happened. "Will Arbery accept a settlement?" Nate said. "Not now," Moore said. "Not with federal fraud implications on the table. He'll refer the larger case to the federal circuit regardless of what Northern Continental wants. The question is whether they want to minimize their exposure by cooperating or maximize their damage by fighting." "They'll cooperate," Clara said. Both men looked at her. "Their Denver counsel came alone," she said. "Northern Continental sent 1 lawyer, not 3. If they were planning to fight the full case, they'd have sent a team. 1 lawyer means they came to assess the damage and determine the settlement parameters." She paused. They already know they're going to lose. They came to find out how much losing is going to cost. Moore looked at her for a moment. Then he turned to Nate. How long has she been doing this? Since before I met her, Nate said. When Arbery reconvened, Northern Continental's counsel requested a private conference with the judge, which Arbery granted with the expression of a man who had expected exactly this and had already decided what he was going to say. The conference lasted 22 minutes. When Arbery returned to the bench, he looked at the assembled courtroom with the measured authority of a man who was about to say something that would require people to rearrange their understanding of the situation. This court finds sufficient grounds to refer the land fraud case to the Federal Territorial Circuit, he said. Northern Continental Rail's current land acquisition activities in the Northern Corridor are stayed pending federal review. Gerald Whitmore's survey correction filing is suspended immediately and referred to the federal investigation. He paused. The boundary claims of the 6 ranching families represented in the consolidated filing are confirmed as legally valid. Pending the federal determination, which this court recommends proceed on an expedited basis. He looked at Moore. Your analyst's work will be entered into the federal record as primary evidence. I will be including a note in the referral commending the quality of the documentation. Then he looked at Clara directly. Miss Whitlock, he said. 20 years on this bench. I don't say this often. He paused. Well done. The courtroom broke. Not dramatically, it wasn't that kind of crowd, but the contained, restrained eruption of people who had been holding something for a long time and had just been given permission to let it out. Walt Pruitt stood up, which for Walt Pruitt was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Roberto Ortega shook his wife's hand formally, and Maria Ortega ignored this and embraced him instead. James Delaney sat very still, and then exhaled slowly, like a man releasing a breath he'd been holding since he signed the complaint. Horace Dunner left before the session was fully closed, which Clara noticed from across the room and filed without comment. Whitmore was pale. His lead lawyer was speaking to him in a low voice, and Whitmore was nodding the way men nodded when they were receiving information that confirmed their worst anticipation. He looked up once across the courtroom, and his eyes found Clara. She looked back at him. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Not with triumph, not with anger, with the same level, complete attention she brought to everything, and then she looked away, because he had already gotten more of her time than he deserved. Outside the courthouse, the ranchers gathered in the way of people who had just come through something together and needed a moment to confirm that they all knew what had happened. Walt Pruitt found Clara first. He stood in front of her and took his hat off, which was the kind of gesture he did not make casually, and he said, 8 months, they told me I didn't understand my own survey documents. He held her gaze. You understood them. You understood them too, Clara said. You needed someone to confirm what you already knew. Pruitt looked at her. Then he nodded the same slow, weighted nod he'd given her at the ranch meeting. You ever need anything, he said, from me or my land or anything I've got, you send word. He put his hat back on. That's not a courtesy. That's a debt. Maria Ortega, who had finished embracing her husband, came to stand beside Clara and said simply, Gracias. Just the one word, but the weight it carried was not a single word's weight. Thomas, who had been hovering at the edge of the group with the expression of someone trying not to visibly vibrate with pride, caught Clara's eye and signed, You did it, with the slightly imprecise enthusiasm of someone who had learned his signs for function and was currently using them for feeling. She signed back, We did it. He beamed. Moore was speaking with Nate a few feet away, and Clara watched them without intruding Moore with his professional composure, restored Nate with the quiet containment of a man who had kept himself very still through a long morning and was now allowing some of that stillness to ease. They shook hands, and Moore said something that made Nate look across the group to Clara, and she looked away before she could read what his expression was, because she suspected it was the kind of expression she needed a moment to prepare for. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride into town. Not the heavy quiet of unresolved things, the settling quiet of a day that had asked a great deal and been met. Cal drove the document wagon with the comfortable silence of a man who had received enough information to be satisfied and didn't need to add to it. Thomas rode alongside and kept looking sideways at Clara, with the particular expression of a young man for whom this day had significantly rearranged his understanding of what was possible. They were 2 miles from the ranch when Nate pulled his horse alongside Clara's. She looked at him. "Arbery's note in the federal referral," he said. "Moore told me what he wrote." He waited until she was looking at his face fully. He wrote that the evidence was assembled by an individual demonstrating exceptional analytical capacity, and that the court recommended the Federal Circuit investigators consult her directly as the case develops. Clara looked at him for a moment. "Moore told you that to tell me?" "Moore told me that because he thought you should know," Nate said. "I'm telling you because I think you should hear it from someone who was in that room when you did it." He paused. "I watched you today. All of it. Corwell coming at you with everything he had, and you just—" He stopped. Started again. "You were the most composed person in that courthouse, including the judge." "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what made it remarkable." She looked at him, this man on his horse 2 miles from his ranch, the ribs still bandaged under his shirt, the silver at his temples, catching the afternoon light, looking at her with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had decided a long time ago that the truth was the only currency worth spending. "Nate," she said. "I know," he said. "Not yet. There's still the federal case," she said. "And the ranch. And my mother arriving next week." "There's still all of that," he said. "But," she said. He looked at her. "But," he agreed. They rode the last 2 miles to the ranch, and behind them the sun was going the particular color it went over Colorado in late afternoon, and ahead of them the lights of the Caldwell ranch were beginning to show in the early dark. Not a lonely light. The lit windows of a place that had people in it. Cal pulling the wagon into the stable. Thomas already off his horse and heading toward the kitchen. Douglas appearing on the back step with the expression of a man prepared to be unimpressed by whatever drama the day had produced. Clara rode into the yard and dismounted, and she stood for a moment in the quiet of the ranch evening with the document cases still strapped to the wagon, and tomorrow's work already forming itself in the back of her mind. The federal investigators would need copies of everything Moore had said, and she would need to begin organizing the archive. But for this one moment, she let tomorrow be tomorrow, and stood in the present moment of the day that had just finished. She thought about $2. She thought about the auction platform and the laughter she had felt through the soles of her boots, and the crowd of people who had assigned a number to what she was worth and been so completely thoroughly wrong. She thought about a man stepping forward. She thought about how much had changed and how much was still unfinished, and how those two things, the changed and the unfinished, were not in conflict, but were simply the shape of a life that was actually being lived. Nate came to stand beside her. Not touching, just present. "You hungry?" he said. "Starving," she said. "Douglas made something with venison that he's been defensive about all day," Nate said. "Which either means it's very good or very bad. Only one way to find out," she said. They walked toward the house, and behind them the Colorado evening did what it always did. Arrived completely without apology, full of stars. And ahead of them, the ranch house glowed with the particular warmth of a place where people who had chosen each other were gathering at the end of a hard day. It was not the end of the story, not by a distance. Whitmore's lawyer would file 3 separate motions in the coming weeks, each one requiring a response. The federal investigators would arrive and spend 4 days at the ranch going through every document Clara had assembled, and one of them, a careful, serious woman from the Denver Circuit office named Hartley, would sit across from Clara for 6 hours and say almost nothing, while Clara walked her through the full timeline, and at the end of it would close her notebook and say, "You should consider law," and Clara would say, "I'll consider it," and mean it. The town of Willow Creek would take approximately 3 weeks to fully revise its understanding of who Clara Whitlock was, which was about 2 weeks longer than it should have taken and considerably shorter than Clara had expected. Horace Dunner would find that the audience for his particular kind of commentary had diminished sharply, which he absorbed with the sullen adaptability of a man who understood where the social current had shifted. Mrs. Henderson at the dressmaker's would stop speaking about the auction entirely, which was its own kind of apology, and Northern Continental Rail, facing a federal investigation into 8 years of coordinated survey fraud across 6 counties, with documented evidence of a dead acquisitions director's written instructions, a cooperative county clerk willing to testify in full, and a 600-page cross-referenced analysis of their internal land acquisition filings, would make the practical decision that men of commerce made when the arithmetic of continued resistance became unfavorable. They would settle. The terms would be favorable to every rancher in the corridor, including 2 of the 5 who had already sold below-market compensation agreements that returned something close to what they had lost. The northern pass would remain in the hands of the people who had worked it. The boundary lines would be restored. Whitmore would resign from his position as county land commissioner before the federal proceedings reached their conclusion, which was the coward's version of accountability, and also the practical version, because it reduced his criminal exposure while removing him from the position he had used to cause the harm. It was imperfect justice, which was the most common kind. But in the Caldwell Ranch main house at the breakfast table, where decisions were made and coffee was poured, and 2 people had built something over the course of a difficult season that neither of them had names for yet, and both of them intended to keep the work would go on. And Clara Whitlock, who had been sold for $2 by a man who thought he knew what she was worth, would sit across from Nathaniel Caldwell every morning and know exactly what she was worth. Not because anyone had told her, because she had always known. And finally, she was somewhere that agreed. The federal investigators left on a Friday, and the ranch exhaled. Not dramatically, not in the way of people who had been holding their breath and finally released it all at once. More like the gradual quiet unwinding of a house that had been braced against weather for so long that the muscles of it had forgotten what it felt like to simply stand without bracing. Cal went back to running the day-to-day with the comfortable authority of a man returned to his natural domain. Thomas resumed his normal rotation without the additional errand writing that the case had demanded of him for weeks. Douglas, who had fed federal investigators the same venison dish he'd been defensive about, and received no complaints, declared the whole affair resolved and went back to running his kitchen like a man who had never been interrupted. Clara sat at the breakfast table on the Saturday morning after the investigators left and felt for the first time in longer than she could precisely measure that the day in front of her contained nothing she had not chosen. It was an unfamiliar feeling. She sat with it for a while, coffee in both hands, and examined it the way she examined everything completely without assumption. She had been running toward something or away from something, or in direct combat with something for so many consecutive weeks that the absence of immediate urgency had a texture she had almost forgotten. She turned it over and found it was not emptiness. It was space. And space, she was discovering, was something she had never in her adult life been given enough of to know what she would do with it. Nate came in from the early morning check of the south pasture and sat down across from her. Thomas brought coffee. Nate looked at the table. No documents, no notebooks open, no wires waiting to be written, and then looked at Clara with the slight, careful expression of a man encountering an unfamiliar version of a familiar situation. "You're not working," he said. "I'm aware," she said. "Is that intentional?" "I'm deciding," she said. He poured his coffee. "What are you deciding?" She looked at him. "What I want," she said. "Now that there's room to want something." He was quiet for a moment. And, "I haven't finished deciding," she said. He accepted this without pushing, which was one of the things she had come to rely on about him. His ability to let a thing be incomplete without needing to resolve it prematurely. He drank his coffee and looked at the far wall and gave her the space she had said she needed without making the giving of it into a performance. After a while she said, "My mother arrives on Wednesday." "I know," he said. "Thomas is driving the wagon to the stage. The East Room is ready." "Has been since last week," he said. "Douglas put extra blankets in. Didn't say why, just did it." Clara looked at her coffee. Douglas putting extra blankets in a room without being asked was in Douglas's particular emotional vocabulary approximately equivalent to a lengthy declaration of welcome. She filed it carefully in the part of herself that collected evidence of the world being different than she had learned to expect. "She doesn't know about you," Clara said. Nate looked at her. "What does she know?" That I have stable work, a good situation. She paused. I didn't know what to call it when I wrote to her. What would you call it now? Nate said. She looked at him directly. I'd call it home, she said. If that's what it is. The word sat between them, with the particular weight of something that had been true for a while and was only now being named. Nate set his cup down. He looked at her with the steady, unhurried attention that was his version of everything important. No rush, no performance. Just the complete presence of a man for whom this moment was the only one that counted. It's what it is, he said. She nodded. Once. The way she nodded when something was confirmed that she had already known but needed to hear from outside herself. Then that's what I'll call it, she said. Wednesday came with the particular clarity of a Colorado autumn morning, and Thomas drove the wagon to the stage with the careful pride of a young man given a significant responsibility. Clara did not go. She had written to her mother extensively in the weeks prior. Long letters detailed covering everything about the ranch and the people and the work and the outcome of the hearing, and she had made her peace with the fact that the first conversation between her mother and the Caldwell ranch would happen without her present, because some reunions needed to begin without an audience. She was in the east yard when the wagon came back. She felt it before she saw it, the vibration of wheels and hooves on the hard ground, and she turned and watched the wagon come through the gate and stop, and Thomas climbed down and went to the other side, and then a woman climbed down with Thomas's help. She was small. Clara had forgotten how small her mother was, or perhaps she had not been this small when Clara was young, and the years had done what years did. She was 61, with white hair under a worn travel bonnet, and the careful movements of someone whose body had become a negotiation rather than a certainty. But her eyes, when they found Clara across the yard, were exactly as Clara remembered them, dark and direct and entirely present. Clara walked toward her. Her mother opened her arms. There were things that happened in that yard in the next few minutes that Clara would not have been able to describe accurately to anyone who asked, because they existed below the level of language in the particular pressure of her mother's hands on her back, the way her mother pulled away to look at her face, and then pulled her back in again, the sound her mother made that Clara could not hear, but could feel through the contact of their bodies. 22 years of language built around absence and alternative communication, and then suddenly, the irreducible fact of her mother's arms, which required none of it. When they separated, her mother held her face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment. Then she said slowly, clearly facing her the way she had always faced her, "You look well." "I am well," Clara said. "You look more than well," her mother said. "You look like yourself, finally." Clara felt something move in her chest at that, not grief, not quite, but the specific emotion that lived at the intersection of grief and relief, which had no clean name, but was one of the realest feelings a person could have. "Come inside," Clara said. "I'll show you everything." Nate met them in the main hall. He took his hat off when Clara's mother came through the door, a gesture so automatic and genuine that Clara's mother noticed it immediately, because 61 years of life had made her an accurate reader of the difference between courtesy and character. She looked at him. He looked at her. Clara stood beside them and watched the two people who mattered most to her in the world take the measure of each other in the way of people who didn't need a great deal of time to arrive at a conclusion. Her mother said to Nate, in the direct and uncomplicated way of a woman who had decided the conventions of introduction were less efficient than simply saying what she meant, "My daughter's letters say a great deal about the ranch and the legal case. They say very little about you." "That sounds accurate," Nate said. "She describes you as fair," her mother said. "I try to be." "She didn't use the word kind," her mother said. "But the things she described were kind. She's careful with language. I think she left the word out on purpose." Nate glanced at Clara. Clara was looking at a point slightly to the left of both of them, with the expression of a woman exercising significant restraint. "She's careful with everything," Nate said. "It's one of the things I rely on." Her mother looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded, the same quality of nod Clara gave, the same economy of approval, the same weight behind it. Clara looked at her mother's nod, and then looked at Nate, and felt somewhere beneath the restraint something that was very close to happiness. The uncomplicated kind. The weeks that followed were the quietest and most ordinary of everything that had preceded them, which was its own kind of extraordinary. Clara's mother settled into the East Room with the practical adaptability of a woman who had lived in uncertain circumstances long enough to know how to make a space her own quickly. She took meals with the household. She and Douglas conducted a careful and initially suspicious negotiation over the kitchen that resolved itself when she produced a recipe for cornbread that Douglas declared with enormous reluctance superior to his own. After that, they coexisted in the kitchen with the mutual respect of two people who had established the terms of their territory and found them acceptable. She and Cal Briggs discovered over the course of a week that they had a shared and passionate opinion about cattle rotation that neither of them had been able to inflict on anyone in years, and their conversations about it, long detailed, sometimes heated, became a regular feature of the ranch's early mornings. She and Thomas communicated primarily through the hand signals he had learned from Clara, which delighted Thomas, and which Clara's mother adopted with the easy fluency of a woman who had spent 22 years communicating with her daughter in every way except the conventional one. And she watched Nate. She watched him, the way she had watched everything in her life, carefully, without announcement, drawing her conclusions from accumulated evidence rather than first impression. She watched him at the breakfast table with Clara, the way the two of them moved through a working morning, with the particular coordination of people who had stopped explaining their system, because the system had become instinct. She watched him in the yard and the stable and the fields, the way he ran his land with a combination of deliberateness and care that told her something true about his character. She watched him look at Clara when Clara wasn't looking back, and what she saw in those unguarded moments told her more than anything else she had observed. She came to find Clara one evening in the East office, where Clara was working on the archive organization that the federal investigators had requested. She sat down across the desk and waited until Clara looked up. "He loves you," her mother said. Clara set down her pencil. "I'm not telling you something you don't know," her mother said. "I'm telling you something you might be talking yourself out of." Clara looked at her mother for a moment. "I'm not talking myself out of anything. You've spent 26 years being told you were too much and not enough at the same time." Her mother said. "Too deaf, too big, too complicated, too much trouble, and not enough of the things that made people decide a person was worth keeping." She held Clara's gaze. "That kind of telling leaves a mark. Even when the telling stops, the mark stays." Clara was quiet. "The man looks at you like you're the most solid thing on his property," her mother said. "And I mean that literally, like everything else might shift, and you're the thing that won't. Do you understand what it means for a man like that to look at a woman like that?" "I understand what it means," Clara said. "Then stop waiting," her mother said. "I'm not waiting," Clara said. "I'm being careful." "There's a difference," her mother said, "between careful and afraid. You were never afraid of anything in your life until it mattered this much." Clara looked at her mother, this small, direct, entirely accurate woman, and felt the particular vulnerability of being known completely by someone who loved you and was therefore not susceptible to any of the defenses you had built for everyone else. "What if I'm wrong about him?" she said. "You're not wrong about him," her mother said. "You've never been wrong about a person in your life. That's your gift. You see clearly." She paused. "The question isn't whether you're wrong. The question is whether you're willing to be right out loud." Clara said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "When did you get this direct?" "I've always been this direct," her mother said. "You were just too young to notice." She stood up, smoothed her dress, and looked at her daughter with the expression of a woman who had said what she came to say and considered her work done. "Don't make him wait too long. A man who is patient enough to give you room is rare. Don't use up all his patience by being afraid of something that's already true." She left. Clara sat alone in the East office for a while after her mother left, and she did something she rarely did. She sat without working. She sat with the thing her mother had named, and she turned it over and looked at it from every angle, the way she looked at everything, and she found that her mother was right. Not about whether she loved him, she had known that for a while, in the way she knew things, which was completely and without the ability to pretend otherwise. But about the fear. The specific quiet fear of a woman who had been assigned a value by the world, and had spent her life proving the world wrong, and had found in the process that proving the world wrong was a safer occupation than believing someone who told you the world had been wrong about you all along. Believing that required a different kind of courage than anything she had demonstrated in a courtroom. She found Nate in the stable. He was where he often was in the evenings, working with his hands the physical counterweight to days that ran heavy on thought and decision. He looked up when she came in, and he waited the way he always waited, giving her the room to say what she had come to say in the way she wanted to say it. She stood in front of him. "My mother told me not to make you wait too long," she said. Nate was very still. "She's right," Clara said. "I've been careful past the point where careful is honest." She held his gaze. "I'm not afraid of this. I was, but I'm not. And I think you deserve to know that." He looked at her for a long moment, the complete, unhurried look of a man for whom this moment was not a surprise, but a confirmation, like a line drawn under something that had already been written. "Clara," he said, "I paid $2 for your contract." "I know," she said. "I want to be clear about something," he said. His voice had the quality it had when he said the things that mattered, level and direct, and stripped of everything that wasn't essential. "That $2 was the most valuable thing I ever spent. Not because of what you did for the ranch, not because of the case or the documents or any of it." He paused. "Because of who you are. Who you've been since the first morning when you got on that horse without asking for help, and then noticed the storm before I did." He held her gaze. "I don't want your gratitude. I don't want your obligation. I know what you want," she said. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "And I want it too." He reached out and took her hand, not tentatively, not with the hesitation of someone uncertain of their welcome, but with the direct and simple certainty of a man who had decided and was acting on his decision. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and she felt the steadiness of it, the same way she felt everything she couldn't hear through the body, through the substance of it, through the unmistakable physical fact of being held by something that intended to hold. She looked at their hands. Then she looked at his face. "I'm not an easy person," she said. "I want you to know that before, Clara," he said. "I know. I work too much," she said. "I forget to sleep. I correct people when they're wrong, even when it would be more politic to let it go." "I know," he said. "I'll never be the kind of woman who—" "Clara." His voice was patient and firm, and entirely without impatience. "I don't want a kind of woman. I want you specifically." He held her gaze. "I have wanted you specifically since you read a storm off a ridgeline and turned to tell me about it before I had looked up from the road." He paused. "I think I knew then. I just needed the rest of the time to be certain." She looked at him, and then she did something she had not done in front of another person in years. She let her face show exactly what she was feeling. Not performance, not control, not the carefully managed composure that had kept her functional through every difficult thing she had survived. Just the actual thing, unguarded and complete, looking at a man who was looking back at her with the same quality of openness. "All right," she said, for the third time in their acquaintance with all the freight it carried by now. "All right. Yes. I trust this. I trust you." He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly to his jaw, a gesture so simple and so deliberate that it landed somewhere below her ability to be measured about anything. "All right," he said back, 3 months later on a Saturday that carried the first real cold of the Colorado winter. Harlan Moore rode out from Willow Creek with a document he had been asked to deliver personally. He came into the main house and found Nate and Clara at the desk in the main office, working inevitably on something related to the ranch, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands and the expression of a man who was pleased about what he was carrying. "Federal Circuit ruled this morning," he said. "Northern Continental's Colorado land acquisition activities are suspended indefinitely pending full investigation. The survey corrections in all 6 affected counties are voided. Every boundary line is restored." He paused. "Whitmore pled to 2 counts of official misconduct. He won't hold public office again." He set the document on the desk. "It's done." Nate picked it up. He read it. He handed it to Clara. She read it. She set it down. She looked at Moore. "Perry." "Full immunity granted in exchange for complete testimony," Moore said. He's cooperating with the federal investigation into Holt's broader activities. Apparently Holt was running a very similar operation in Kansas before Colorado. He paused. The federal investigators want to know if you'd be willing to consult on the Kansas documents. Clara looked at Nate. Nate looked at Clara. He said nothing. He simply waited the way he always waited, giving her the room. "Tell them yes," she said. Moore smiled, a genuine, unrestrained smile that was unusual enough on his professional face to register as significant. "I thought you'd say that." He picked up his hat. "I'll leave you to it then." He started for the door, then stopped. "One more thing." He turned back. "The territorial bar has a provision for exceptional circumstance admission. An individual who demonstrates documented legal analytical capacity at the level of a practicing attorney can be admitted to the bar without formal degree, subject to an examination." He looked at Clara directly. "I've already submitted the supporting documentation. The examination date is in the spring." He paused. "Think about it." He left. The office was quiet. Clara sat with Moore's last words for a long moment. She turned them over, the way she turned everything completely from every angle. An attorney. The word had a shape she had never tried on before. She thought about Daniel Garrett's office in Pueblo. The hearings she had sat through invisible at the back of the room, the documents she had read and understood and never been asked about. She thought about Judge Arbery's courtroom, about Corwell's questions, and her own answers, about the federal investigator. Hartley, sitting across from her for 6 hours, and then closing her notebook and saying, "You should consider law." She thought, "I have been doing this work without the name for it my entire life." She thought the name was always available. Nobody offered it. She thought it is being offered now. She looked at Nate. He was watching her with the expression he wore when he was letting her be wherever she was without pulling her back before she was ready. "You'd have to go to Denver," he said. "For the examination. Probably for the first cases if you pass." "I'd come back," she said. "I know you'd come back," he said. "That's not what I'm saying." He held her gaze. "I'm saying the ranch can manage. I'm saying Cal has been capable of running this property without significant supervision for years, and simply hasn't been required to demonstrate it. I'm saying..." He paused. "I'm saying that whatever you decide to do with what you're capable of, this is where you live. That's settled. The rest is yours to determine." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are," she said slowly, "a remarkable man." "I'm a practical man," he said. "It would be impractical to have someone with your capacity and not want her to use it." "That's not why you're saying it," she said. "No," he admitted. "It isn't." She reached across the desk and picked up Moore's document. The federal ruling, the voided surveys, the restored boundary lines. Everything they had built and fought for over the past months, and she held it in both hands and felt the weight of it. Real paper, real outcomes. Real lives restored to the people who had lived them honestly against the efforts of people who had decided that honesty was an obstacle to profit. She set it back down. "I'll take the examination," she said. Thomas appeared in the doorway. He had an instinct for arriving at moments of significance that was either excellent timing or careful observation, and knowing Thomas, probably both. He looked between them and said, "Everything all right?" "Everything is all right," Clara said. He grinned broad and unguarded, the grin of a young man who had spent months watching something difficult resolve into something good, and was openly glad about it. "Douglas wants to know if there's occasion enough for the good venison." Nate looked at Clara. Clara looked at Nate. "Tell him yes," Nate said. The evening that followed was the kind that settled into a person's memory, not because it was dramatic, but because it was complete. The whole household gathered in the way of people who had come through something together and had arrived at the other side of it still intact and still willing to sit at the same table. Clara's mother at the far end with Cal Briggs, deep in an argument about the spring rotation that both of them were thoroughly enjoying. Douglas delivering the venison with the proprietary satisfaction of a man whose cooking had been formally recognized as worthy of occasion. Thomas pouring coffee with the careful attentiveness of a young man who had decided that caring for the people around him was a skill worth practicing. Nate sat beside Clara. not across the table. Beside her the way he had begun sitting at meals some weeks ago. So naturally, and without announcement, that the transition had been noted by everyone on the property and commented on by none of them, because they were working people, and working people recognized when something had resolved itself and let it be. At some point in the meal, Walt Pruitt arrived unannounced, which was Walt Pruitt's style, with a bottle of something he described as celebratory, and which Cal described as dangerous, and which turned out to be both. He had heard about the federal ruling in town, and had ridden out because, as he said, sitting on a piece of news like that without doing something about it was not in his nature. He raised his glass and looked at Clara. 8 months they told me I didn't understand my own land, he said in the direct and undecorated way of a man who said exactly what he meant, and not a syllable more. You gave me it back. He looked at the table, at Nate, at Cal, at Thomas and Douglas, and Clara's mother, and the assembled household of a ranch that had become, in the month since a summer auction, something considerably larger than its deed described. All of you. He held up his glass. To people who don't look away. Nobody improved on it. They drank. Later, after Pruitt had ridden back to his land with the comfortable satisfaction of a man who had delivered his tribute and could now rest after Clara's mother had retired to the East Room, and Douglas had surrendered the kitchen, and Thomas had banked the fire, and Cal had made his final check of the property and gone to the bunkhouse. The ranch settled into the particular quiet of a place that had finished its day. Clara and Nate sat on the back step, the way they had always sat. The coffee they poured that they rarely finished. The Colorado night doing what it did. The land they had fought for, extending outward in every direction, under a sky that had no interest in the human business conducted beneath it, and was magnificent anyway. She felt him shift beside her, felt him turn to look at her. She knew the quality of it by now, could feel his attention, the way she felt everything she couldn't hear through the substance and presence of it. Tell me what you're thinking, he said. She looked at the dark outline of the ridge, at the land, at the 12,000 acres that were still his and still theirs and still exactly where they were supposed to be. I'm thinking about the auction platform, she said. About standing there while Dunner held up 2 fingers and the whole town laughed. And I'm thinking that if I could go back to that woman to myself standing there, I wouldn't tell her it was going to be all right. She paused. She wouldn't have believed it. She'd heard that too many times already. What would you tell her? Clara thought about it. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything, without the softening that comfort required, or the bitterness that truth sometimes demanded. I'd tell her to pay attention to the one man who isn't laughing, she said, and to trust what she sees. Nate was quiet beside her. She turned and looked at him. This man who had stepped forward when everyone else had stepped back, who had paid $2 not to own her, but to refuse in the only way immediately available to him, to participate in the particular cruelty of a crowd, deciding a human life had no value. This man who had given her a table to work at, and a room for her mother, and a courtroom, and a federal case, and a word home, and meant all of it with the uncomplicated sincerity of someone who had decided that the truth was the only way he knew how to do anything. She reached out and took his hand. He closed his fingers around hers immediately, the way he did everything that mattered, without hesitation, without reservation, with the full intention of a man who had made his decision and was not revising it. They sat in the quiet of the Colorado night, on the back step of a ranch that had been fought for and won, and the stars did what stars did over the high country, which was simply to be enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the land extended outward in every direction, with the solid permanence of something that had been there long before the people on it and would be there long after. But right now, it was theirs. And the woman who had been sold for $2, who had stood on a platform with her hands folded and her chin up, while an entire town decided she was worth less than a sack of flour, sat beside the man who had refused to agree. And she was home, and she knew it, and she was not letting go. Some things in this world get decided by the wrong people. And some things, the things that matter most, the things that last, get decided by the ones who stay. Clara Whitlock stayed, and that made all the difference.